Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we descend into a world lit by flickering torches and soaked in ancient dread. Deep within the corridors of history, the Ottoman Empire casts a long shadow, not just for its grandeur and political dominance, but also for the chilling creativity of its punishments. Steel rings echo off stone walls, guards shuffle in crimson uniforms, and somewhere in the distance a prisoner breathes his last through clenched teeth. Just a heads up, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious where my listeners are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with the punishment that made even battle-hardened soldiers look away: impaling. It wasn't just gruesome, it was surgical in its cruelty. To be impaled in the Ottoman world meant becoming a vertical warning sign, often posted at the gates of cities or along roadsides. This wasn't random chaos, it was deliberate messaging. Imagine this: a sharpened wooden stake, 8 to 10 feet high, is firmly planted into the ground. The condemned is stripped, restrained, and hoisted. But here's where things get truly unsettling. The stake isn't thrust wildly. No, the executioner must insert it carefully through the lower body, often avoiding major organs so the victim remains alive for hours, sometimes days. The art of the slow death was as calculated as it was horrific. The impaled figure was then raised upright, gravity doing the rest of the cruel work. Birds circled, bystanders whispered prayers or turned their faces, and the message: obedience or else. This method was particularly reserved for traitors, enemy spies or rebels, people whose punishment needed to echo. Some historians argue whether this originated solely within Ottoman borders, or if it was imported from earlier practices in the Balkans and Persia. What's certain is that the Ottomans elevated it, both in frequency and finesse. Ottoman soldiers were known to carry sharpened stakes in their kits, ready to erect scenes of terror after battles. In 1453, following the conquest of Constantinople, stories circulated of dozens impaled as public examples, their silhouettes casting eerie shadows on the city walls at dusk. Yet for all the horror, there was a certain bureaucratic neatness to it. Orders for impalement often came with specific instructions: how high, how public, how long the victim should last. In the 16th century, a Hungarian traveller wrote of seeing a forest of the damned. Outside Edirne, hundreds of pikes with what he assumed were once men, now bleached by sun and picked clean by crows. The Ottomans didn't see this purely as cruelty. In a grim twist, it was believed that impalement offered a kind of warped mercy. Because the body remained mostly intact and blood was kept internal, it aligned with the Islamic belief that a body should be buried whole. A strange rationalization? Yes, but not uncommon in empires balancing doctrine and deterrence. Let's be honest though, no amount of spiritual wholeness could undo the raw agony. Victims rarely screamed after the first hour. Their vocal cords gave out. Some foamed at the mouth, some prayed until the end. A few chillingly remained conscious long enough to see nightfall, their forms now part of the dark silhouette of a watchtower. You won't see that on a travel brochure for Istanbul. And still, there were variations. In times of revolt, multiple impalements might occur in synchronized displays, prisoners lined up, stakes lowered in unison. In other cases, women were spared the stake but witnessed their loved ones hoisted, forced to watch in silence. The psychological toll was a punishment all its own. A lesser-known twist: impalement competitions. Not officially sanctioned, of course, but among certain guards, bets were made. How long the condemned would survive, whether they'd scream or faint, whether crows would arrive before nightfall. It's one of those disturbing human details that make ancient punishment feel uncomfortably modern. Schadenfreude, it seems, isn't bound by time. And remember, this wasn't hidden away. Impalement was theatre. The audience? Civilians, merchants, even children. Vendors sold food nearby. Some claim the scent of roasted chickpeas mixed with death in the summer air was particularly unbearable. One chronicler, writing in the 1700s, noted how young boys would dare each other to run close to the stakes. Childhood games with a front row seat to horror. Historians still debate whether impalement's use decreased over time due to shifting moral views, or simply became less practical as gunpowder and diplomacy replaced brute fear. What is clear is that its memory lingered far longer than the practice itself. In Bulgarian folklore and Serbian ballads, the impaler is a villain, a boogeyman who still stalks hills and ruins. Of course, one can't speak of impalement without invoking Vlad the Impaler, often wrongly associated with the Ottomans, but whose rivalry with the Empire involved grotesque exchanges of brutality. When Vlad allegedly impaled thousands of Ottoman prisoners and left them for Sultan Mehmed II to find, the Sultan reportedly turned back, not out of fear, but out of grim respect. Whether this is apocryphal or not, it illustrates just how central impalement had become to the Ottoman imagination. There's even an architectural legacy. Some old forts and city gates have carvings or indentations, places where stakes once stood. Tour guides might gloss over them, but historians know these were sites of memory where fear became fossil. Even the word for impalement in Ottoman Turkish carried layered meaning. Kasıklamak could mean to betray or to pierce, a linguistic holdover from centuries of fear. It still exists in modern Turkish slang, often used jokingly to describe getting ripped off, but the etymology is razor sharp. As the empire modernised in the 19th century, these punishments faded, replaced by prisons, trials and written law. But every so often, a scholar digging through court records stumbles upon a final case, a late impalement from some border town where old habits died hard. A few more cries lost to the wind. So tonight, if you find yourself walking down a quiet, torchlit path in an ancient city, and the wind rustles the bushes just right, listen closely. That silence you hear, it once echoed with the gasps of the condemned, high above the ground, watching stars fade into dawn, praying to be seen, or not to be seen at all. The flames bubble and hiss beneath a cauldron of thick iron. In the distance, a wailing chorus rises, not screams of shock, but of dread, for everyone in the crowd knows exactly what's about to happen. No trick, no last-minute pardon. The condemned stands trembling near the edge, and the executioner, gloved and expressionless, gives the smallest nod. This is no allegory, no cautionary tale. This is boiling, Ottoman style. Boiling alive, whether in water, oil or pitch, was not the empire's most common punishment. But when it was used, it made an unforgettable point. Reserved for crimes considered both treasonous and sacrilegious, boiling was designed for impact. It was theatrical, loud, visceral. It lingered in both the senses and the imagination. The Ottomans inherited and reimagined this from older practices. Byzantines, Mongols, even earlier Mesopotamian cultures toyed with the idea of cooking the condemned alive. The Ottomans added layers of ceremony and symbolism. Before the punishment, the cauldron was paraded through the streets, blackened from decades of use. Spectators followed the trail of smoke, some in horror, others in morbid curiosity. And sometimes, as records suggest, the pot was not empty. Accounts vary, but some say it was used as early as the 15th century for corrupt officials, particularly tax collectors who stole from the Sultan or skimmed too generously off peasant tributes. Imagine that, a bureaucrat turned broth. One chronicler noted with gruesome detail a case where an officer from the Janissaries was boiled slowly in vinegar and salt water, a method believed to increase pain while preserving flesh longer for display. A pickled betrayal, they called it. It's one of those lines you can't forget, no matter how much you want to. It wasn't always instantaneous. The boiling process could be staggered. The victim might be suspended above the pot first, steam curling around their face, the heat distorting their vision. Then lowered gradually, legs first, then hips, then torso, until only the head remained above the churning surface. It was not just execution, it was disassembly by degrees. A witness from the mid-1600s described the sound as like a festival of snapping branches, which, well, let's not unpack that too literally. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans actually used boiling as frequently as records claim, or whether tales were exaggerated by foreign travellers keen to paint the empire in Gothic hues. But court transcripts from the Divan, a kind of imperial council, do reference boiling as a listed punishment, and specific tools, like reinforced cauldrons found in old fortresses, add weight to the stories. Perhaps the most notorious case was that of a court eunuch accused of poisoning one of the Sultan's favoured concubines. The palace didn't just demand punishment, they wanted a spectacle, so he was led through Topkapı Palace, past servants and guards who refused to meet his eyes, and brought to the courtyard where a specially prepared pot awaited. The details are scant, but one diary from a palace scribe describes the smoke lingering for 3 days, curling around the minarets like a shroud. There's also mention of spice. Yes, spice. In one infamous execution from 1712, peppercorns and cloves were reportedly added to the oil. Symbolic? Perhaps. Or maybe the message was that betrayal would be seasoned and served. Metaphor made flesh. One scholar called it the empire's cruelest culinary metaphor, and honestly it's hard to argue with that. Boiling wasn't just a punishment, it was a purification ritual in some minds, particularly for crimes that polluted the sultan's household or sullied the religious order. Fire and water, cleansing agents in many cultures, combined here in a way that twisted purity into punishment. And when the victim perished, sometimes what remained was poured into the Bosphorus, drifting away like a foul soup. In other cases, the remains were left to cool, then displayed in iron cages. The smell, reportedly, was unbearable. Not just the usual death stench, but something far worse. Cooking human flesh, as it turns out, leaves a very specific signature in the air, one that hung over marketplaces, lingered near city gates, and clung to the robes of those who attended. No incense or rosewater could mask it. And yes, the crowd attended. Boiling was one of those events where people knew they shouldn't look, but couldn't help themselves. Even women and children came, some believing the heat carried away the soul, and that to witness it was to ensure the victim didn't return as a ghost. A superstitious detail, but one mentioned in more than one regional folktale. The location of these executions mattered. In Istanbul, they were often staged in specific courtyards or outside key gates, places symbolic of justice. In smaller towns, large pots were borrowed from bathhouses or merchant kitchens, sometimes still stained with lentil stew or mutton fat. A grotesque reuse, yes, but practical in its own horrifying way. And just when you think you've heard the worst, here comes the fringe detail. In certain cases, live animals were added to the pot along with the condemned. Not as part of the punishment per se, but because they were deemed spiritually tied to the crime. Familiars, bad omens, or pets used in witchcraft. Cats, birds, even a monkey in one account from Anatolia. Imagine that scene. Boiling fur, fluttering feathers, chaos in steam. One can't help but wonder, why not just behead them? Quicker, simpler, less theatrical. But the answer lies in optics. A beheading is efficient. A boiling is a message. It lingers. In the mind, in the nose, even in the soil. The Ottomans knew that sometimes a punishment needed to be more than death. It needed to be remembered. And yet, as with so many things in Ottoman justice, there's a paradox. At times, boiling was merciful, compared to other methods. Think about it. Swift immersion in superheated oil might kill quicker than hours of slow impalement. Some executioners, out of pity or haste, reportedly heated the oil to blistering levels before the victim was even present. A small mercy. A boiling point with no return. Eventually, by the late 18th century, boiling all but disappeared from official record. Enlightenment ideals, growing foreign diplomacy, and the modernisation of legal codes pushed it into the shadows. But it never quite left the imagination. Turkish ghost stories still whisper of Kuzgun Tencerella, the scalding pots, that roam palace ruins or appear in dreams, and old cauldrons displayed in museums. Some still carry scorch marks not easily explained by soup alone. Next time you pass a giant metal pot in an Ottoman kitchen display, peer inside. Imagine it filled with oil, smoke curling upwards, the air tight with fear. The walls remember, the floor remembers. The silence afterward, more haunting than the screams. The corridor is narrow, just wide enough for a guard to pass with a torch. The air is heavy, damp, sour and still. As the door creaks open, a sliver of light spills into the darkness, revealing a slumped figure in a corner. His beard is overgrown, eyes sunken, and skin pale from months without sun. He mutters to himself, softly at first, then louder. Gibberish. A hymn. Maybe both. This is the cage of madness, one of the Ottoman Empire's more insidious punishments, where the pain wasn't inflicted on the body, but on the mind. Known in Turkish as delilik kafesi, the insanity cage was as much prison as performance. This punishment was not for the rebellious peasant or the foreign spy. It was reserved for those whose offences required something lingering. Men of influence, disgraced officials, failed would-be sultans. The kind of people who needed to disappear slowly, their minds unravelling far from public view. Housed beneath palaces or buried deep within fortress walls, these cages weren't even always cages in the classic sense. Sometimes they were iron-barred cells barely the size of a closet. Sometimes they were old cisterns repurposed into chambers with no light or ventilation. But always, they were isolated, soundproof, unreachable. The most infamous of these was located within the Topkapi Palace itself. The cafes, or the cage, a heavily guarded section where princes were confined. Now, officially, this wasn't punishment per se. The royal family justified it as a way to prevent civil war by keeping rival heirs contained. But make no mistake, it was psychological torture. Imagine spending decades in a gilded prison with no control over your fate, knowing you'd only be released if your brother died, or if you were killed first. Many princes who lived in the cafes emerged unrecognisable. Some babbled endlessly. Others refused to speak at all. A few tore out their own hair or smeared food on the walls in cryptic patterns. The eerie thing? Some weren't even guilty of anything. They were simply born too close to the throne. Historians still debate whether this system prevented bloodshed or merely relocated it. After all, the early Ottoman succession tradition involved fratricide. The new sultan would often execute his brothers to secure power. The cafes was supposed to be more humane. But if you asked the men who spent decades within, they'd probably disagree. In one harrowing case from the 17th century, Prince Mustafa spent nearly 20 years inside the cafes before becoming sultan. When he finally emerged, his mental state was so fractured that he would toss coins to fish and attempt to speak to his turban. Courtiers were forced to stand silently as he shouted at invisible enemies. His reign lasted 2 chaotic years before he was deposed and returned to confinement. The message was clear. The cage breaks you, whether you survive it or not. Outside the royal circle, other versions of the Cage of Madness existed in prisons like Yedikale Fortress or the dungeons beneath Bursa. In these cases, prisoners were deliberately isolated with no sensory input, no windows, no visitors, no books. Water was given irregularly, food was flavourless mush, and guards were instructed not to speak. Some prisoners reportedly didn't hear a human voice for months. One chronicler in the 18th century described visiting a cell and seeing writing etched into the stone wall using only fingernails. It was a list of days, or maybe names, no one could tell. Another wall bore drawings of faces, some smiling, some screaming. It was as if the prisoner had conjured company out of madness. A particularly grim variant involved cages suspended above the ground, just high enough that the prisoner couldn't sit comfortably without hunching. They'd sway gently with the wind, a ceaseless, maddening motion. These were typically placed near palace gardens so that the confined could hear laughter, birdsong, and music, but never participate. A daily reminder of the world just beyond their reach. And then there's the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Many of these punishment cells were designed to muffle noise. Guards walked barefoot on carpets. Doors were layered with thick padding. The idea was simple. Deprive the mind of stimulation, and it will turn on itself. Some prisoners hallucinated voices. Others claimed to hear divine music. One man insisted he'd heard a choir of frogs reciting the Quran in Latin. Not all madness was accidental, though. In some cases, the goal was very much to drive the prisoner insane, because madness rendered them politically harmless. A madman couldn't testify, couldn't conspire, couldn't lead. It was a quiet form of execution, death of the mind while the body lingered. Still, there were exceptions. Some inmates resisted the madness. They recited poetry, performed rituals, or created imaginary courts where they ruled as sultans of their tiny realms. One prisoner reportedly tamed a mouse and trained it to deliver crumbs across the cell. Others composed entire novels or theological treatises in their heads, reciting them daily so they wouldn't forget. There's a strange resilience in that, a refusal to let the mind rot. But not everyone was so lucky. One Ottoman vizier, after 6 years in isolation, emerged convinced that he was a teapot. He refused to walk unless tipped sideways and demanded hot water be poured into his sleeves. The Sultan, amused, allowed him to live as palace entertainment for a few months before, predictably disappearing again. A fringe but fascinating tidbit. Some believed the Cage of Madness could actually bestow divine insight. A few Sufi mystics claimed that isolation broke the ego and opened the soul to revelation. One dervish voluntarily entered confinement for 3 years and emerged claiming to have conversed with angels. The court had him flogged for heresy, but his writings later inspired a minor religious sect. From an architectural standpoint, these cages were masterpieces of control. Narrow vents ensured minimal airflow. Latticed shadows from small openings created patterns on the floor that changed throughout the day, giving the prisoner a warped sense of time. Food was lowered on ropes, never handed directly. Water came through pipes with no visible source. The result was a perfect storm of disconnection, and unlike other forms of Ottoman punishment, public, theatrical, loud, the cage was intimate, private. Nobody saw the deterioration. No crowds gasped. No mothers wept in the square. Madness crept in silently, stealing the prisoner piece by piece. It's worth noting that the practice didn't end with the fall of the empire. Even into the 19th century, whispers of similar confinement appeared in court records. One story tells of a French ambassador visiting Istanbul who was politely warned not to ask too many questions about certain wings of the palace. When he did anyway, he found himself invited to leave the city within 48 hours. Today, some of these cells still exist, sealed off behind modern walls or hidden under museums. Tour guides don't mention them, maps omit them. But if you know where to look, you might find a tiny barred window beneath the floorboards, or a door with rusted hinges that opens onto nothing. And if you listen closely, past the echo of footsteps and museum chatter, you might hear the faint hum of a man still reciting the same poem he started 3 centuries ago. So when you dream tonight, and your mind wanders through stone corridors and cold floors, remember the cage. Not for the bodies it held, but for the thoughts it stole. The mind is a fragile flame, and in the Ottoman Empire they knew exactly how to snuff it without ever raising a hand. There's something almost elegant about silk. Soft, strong, expensive. In most settings it wraps royalty, drapes palaces, or lines treasure chests. But in the Ottoman Empire, silk had another purpose entirely, one that unravelled in the shadows of Topkapı Palace. It tightened silently around the throat of the condemned, a luxurious noose in the hands of executioners. This was the bowstring execution, swift, bloodless, and chillingly precise. To understand the bowstring's role in Ottoman punishment, we need to enter the empire's inner sanctum, the palace. Here, where intrigue thickened like honey and betrayal was just another form of ambition, executions were never loud or messy. Shedding royal blood was forbidden, not out of mercy, but out of symbolism. The Sultan, considered semi-divine, did not taint the earth or palace floors with the lifeblood of the elite. So instead of swords or axes, they used silk cords. The bowstring, or commend, was typically made of silk or horsehair, twisted tight to ensure it could strangle a man cleanly. The method was elegant in its violence. 2 executioners would stand behind the condemned, slip the cord around the neck and pull in perfect synchrony, one to the left, one to the right. With enough force, the vertebrae snapped, and the condemned dropped without a sound. Executioners trained for this. Known as Telet, they were state employees, well-fed and well-practiced, living in a house just outside the palace walls. Their job required precision. Too fast and the neck wouldn't break. Too slow, and the condemned would suffocate slowly, clawing at the air. The goal was quiet finality. The victims? Not your average street thief. Bowstring executions were reserved for nobles, high-ranking officials, and especially wayward princes. Men too dangerous to leave alive, but too important to kill messily. The most infamous cases often involved court politics, viziers who lost favour, admirals who failed in war, princes accused, often falsely, of treason. The Sultan's word alone sealed their fate. Once the order was given, there was no trial, no appeal. The condemned might be summoned under pretence, perhaps to a meeting or an evening meal, and when they arrived, the executioners would be waiting in the next room, cords in hand. One unsettling ritual involved showing the condemned the bowstring before execution, a subtle signal. Nothing was said. No accusation shouted. The man simply saw the silk and understood. Some went quietly, others begged. A few ran, but not far. Palace guards had long since locked every possible escape route. Perhaps the most infamous bowstring execution occurred in 1622, when Sultan Osman II, just a teenager, was deposed and murdered by his own janissaries. In a twisted reversal, the boy Sultan himself fell victim to the cord, though messily. Eyewitnesses claim the executioners bungled it. Osmond struggled, and the process took far longer than usual. His cries echoed through the palace gardens, a sound not easily forgotten. Historians still argue whether this particular execution was symbolic or desperate, whether it was the Janissaries asserting dominance or simply removing a threat. But what's clear is that the use of the bowstring reached even the throne itself. In the Ottoman world, no one, not even the Sultan, was beyond the silk. The executioners themselves lived lives of grim detachment. Ostracised from polite society, they were given homes and wages, but barred from mingling with civilians. When walking through the city, they wore distinctive black robes and rode donkeys rather than horses, a visual cue to avoid them. Children crossed the street. Merchants turned away. The touch of a kellet, it was believed, could curse your household. Still, they weren't entirely reviled. Some feared them, some bribed them. A few even became minor celebrities, their methods whispered about in taverns and hammams. There's one tale of a particularly gifted executioner who could end a life in under 3 seconds with a single pull. No bruising, no delay. He retired with honours and a generous pension, though he was reportedly haunted by nightmares until the end of his days. Sometimes, the bowstring executions took place in private rooms within Topkapi, other times in the Yedikule fortress, especially if the condemned was a foreign ambassador or noble. These events were never public. The body was often wrapped and buried the same night. Mourning was discouraged. Family members were watched closely afterward, lest revenge simmer beneath the surface. But not all victims stayed buried in silence. One 17th century case tells of a Georgian prince who was garroted after a failed plot to usurp a regional governor. Legend has it that his ghost still haunts the corridor near the Sultan's library, his footsteps marked by the faint rustle of silk across tile. Guards refuse to patrol there at night, and one corridor light is said to flicker on its own. Make of that what you will. There's also the ritual disposal of the cords. After an execution, the bowstring was sometimes burned or buried, rarely reused. Executioners believed the silk held a memory, a residual presence. A cord that killed a prince, especially, might be hidden in a secret part of the palace, sealed away like a cursed object. A few were reportedly displayed in secret collections, but none survive today. Or so they say. A quirky detail? Executioners were required to keep a record of each bowstring used, the length, material, and date. Ottoman bureaucracy at its finest. These ledgers, tucked into dusty palace archives, reveal a grim poetry. Silken cord of red, 84 centimetres, used on the Grand Admiral Mehmed Pasha, 18 Shaban 1110. It's chillingly matter-of-fact. Death, logged and filed. Perhaps most haunting of all was the silence. Unlike other forms of Ottoman punishment, the bowstring didn't scream, it didn't weep, it simply tightened, ended, and was gone. No cries for mercy, no defiant last words, just the whisper of silk, the snap of bone, and the soft slump of a body folding into itself. The practice faded by the mid-19th century. As the empire modernised and Western legal reforms trickled in, the bowstring fell out of fashion. Executions became more standardised. Firing squads, formal trials, public hangings. The silk cords were retired, their quiet terror no longer useful in an empire struggling to redefine itself. But the memory lingers. In Turkish idioms, Görün mezi pek, the invisible silk cord, refers to unseen threats, betrayals cloaked in elegance. The phrase survives, even if the practice doesn't. And in some corners of Istanbul, older generations still swear that the ghosts of bowstring victims pace the palace grounds. Forever searching for justice they were never granted. So tonight, if your dreams take you to tiled halls and moonlit courtyards, listen for the rustle of robes, the click of sandals, and if you see 2 men standing silently with a cord stretched between them, don't run, don't speak, just bow your head. The bowstring waits for no one. The prisoner is barefoot, of course. That's the first rule. No shoes, no socks, no wraps or cloths, just bare soles, soft, exposed, and trembling. The guards lead him to a long wooden bench known as the falaka sepasi. It's simple, sturdy, and polished by countless bodies that have been strapped across it. Nearby, 2 men prepare thick rods of polished wood. They aren't swords, nor whips, but they'll carve pain just as effectively. This is bastinado, the Ottoman specialty of foot beating. known locally as falaka. At first glance, it almost looks comedic. A grown man tied down, legs hoisted in the air like a flailing child during diaper change, his soul stretched and waiting. But the laughter dies quickly, because once those rods start falling, a different sound takes over. The thud of wood on flesh, the muffled gasps, the ragged breathing. No blood, no broken bones, just agony. Bastinado wasn't a fringe punishment in the Ottoman world. It was everywhere. In schools, courts, army camps, even tax offices. From wayward schoolboys to hardened criminals, the falaka made no class distinctions. Its simplicity made it universally accessible. No expensive equipment, no gallows, just 2 strong arms and a flat space to work. The process was methodical. First, the condemned was restrained, either flat on their back or stomach, depending on the version. Their feet were elevated, using a yoke or suspended between 2 guards. Then came the strikes. Not wild flailing, but rhythmic, targeted blows to the arches, the heels, the balls of the feet. The skin reddened quickly, then purpled. After a dozen hits, the nerves began screaming. After 2 dozen, the man might faint. But here's the thing. Falaka didn't kill. It maimed. It terrified. It incapacitated. But it rarely led to death. And that was precisely the point. The Ottomans didn't always want their subjects dead. They wanted them compliant, humiliated, reminded. Foot-beating let the punishment echo for weeks or months. Victims limped for days. Some couldn't walk for weeks. A few never walked properly again. Historians still argue about its origin. Was it imported from Egypt, Persia, China? Variants of foot-beating existed across many empires. But the Ottomans perfected it, institutionalized it, and gave it a distinct flavour. In military academies, cadets were often flogged not for insubordination, but for lacklustre grades. A failed math exam could earn 10 strikes. In one notorious case from the 18th century, a young janissary was beaten so thoroughly he could not stand during inspection, yet he passed the exam on the 2nd try. There were gradations of the punishment. Light falaka might involve 5 or 10 hits, more a warning than a sentence. Severe falaka could go into the hundreds, sometimes delivered over multiple sessions. The rods used varied by context. For minor offences, thin willow branches. For serious crimes, thick cane or even metal-reinforced batons. And it wasn't just the act itself. It was the ritual. Before each falaka session, a scribe recorded the offence and punishment in an official logbook. One of these, preserved in the Istanbul archives, includes such entries as Thursday, 3rd of Rajab, Yusuf, son of Hassan, received 40 lashes on the soles for mocking the Imam. The handwriting is impeccable, the ink still sharp, a bureaucrat's brushstroke of pain. A quirky aside. Some court scribes doubled as falaka counters. Their job wasn't just to observe, it was to count aloud. Each strike punctuated by a number. Bir, iki, üç. A grim metronome of justice. One scholar even noted how this cadence had a strange hypnotic effect, making the punishment seem more mechanical, less personal, a kind of bureaucratic detachment from suffering. But falaka wasn't always legal. Over time, reformers in the 19th century tried to ban or restrict it. Foreign diplomats, particularly those from Britain and France, found the practice barbaric and repeatedly pressured the empire to stop. In one amusing record, a French envoy fainted while witnessing a falaka demonstration, clutching his handkerchief to his face and muttering about civilization. The Ottomans, for their part, insisted that falaka was humane. After all, it spared the head and the heart. Despite the criticism, it remained popular. In fact, even as other punishments faded, falaka persisted. Why? Because it worked. It was fast, reversible, and didn't clutter prisons. It could be inflicted on the spot, inside a courtroom, in a barracks, even at a street corner. And perhaps most critically, it left no scars visible to casual observers. A beaten man could attend mosque the next day, hiding his agony beneath calm footsteps and a forced smile. Of course, not every victim was silent. Folk songs emerged, plaintive, bitter ballads sung by peasants and petty criminals, lamenting the fire that burned not my soul but my soul's. One particularly popular tune described a lover whose feet were so bruised she danced no more, cursed not by heartbreak, but by a jealous rival who bribed the local magistrate. In some cases, women were subjected to falaka, though it was rarer and usually conducted behind closed doors. The records are hazy, deliberately so. Modesty rules demanded discretion, but fragments survive in private diaries, suggesting that female punishment by foot beating was often tied to accusations of infidelity, gossip or defiance within the harem. And then there were the professional falaka men, specialists who offered their services for private discipline. That's right, an Ottoman form of mercenary punishment. Wealthy households sometimes hired them to correct unruly sons or misbehaving servants. One such man, nicknamed Topukçu Ali, Ali the Heelmaster, was reportedly able to deliver 100 lashes without breaking rhythm. Parents booked him weeks in advance. The fact that he was also a part-time poet adds a layer of absurdity that's hard to ignore. The psychological toll was enormous. Some victims developed aversions to bare feet. Others swore they could feel phantom pain whenever they heard wood striking tile. One soldier who'd endured falaka as a recruit later refused to remove his boots, even in bed. His wife eventually divorced him, citing emotional distance and smelly linens. But what truly set falaka apart was its blend of cruelty and practicality. It didn't sever limbs, it didn't kill, it didn't inspire martyrdom. Instead, it left you hobbling, resentful, humiliated, but alive. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. It gave pain without closure, punishment without end. By the 20th century, falaka had faded from the courts but lingered in schools and military camps. Even today, older Turks sometimes reference it jokingly. "Keep acting up," a grandfather might say, tapping his walking stick. "You'll meet the falaka yet." It's half warning, half nostalgia. A nod to an era when justice walked softly but carried a big stick. So tonight, as you stretch out your feet under the covers, wiggle your toes, and enjoy the warmth of your bed, be thankful. In another time, another place, those souls might be elevated, bound, and waiting for the first crack of wood. The falaka didn't need swords or fire, just silence, discipline, and a pair of trembling feet. A low wooden stool sits in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by silence. No chains, no whips, no blood on the walls, just the soft scratch of scissors being sharpened nearby. A young man kneels, head bowed, his hair long, unkempt, and full of dust. Around him stand guards, not with weapons, but with razors and bowls of water. There will be no violence today, at least not the obvious kind. This is Saç Kiran, the head-shaving punishment that humiliated rather than harmed, but often cut deeper than a blade ever could. While the Ottoman Empire was no stranger to physical torment, it also specialised in symbolic pain. Publicly shaving a person's head, particularly in patterns or partial swaths, was one such technique. On the surface, it seems almost gentle. After all, hair grows back, doesn't it? But under the Ottomans, this act became a slow-burn form of disgrace, eroding dignity day by day, week by week, strand by strand. Head shaving as punishment targeted identity. In Ottoman society, one's hair was more than aesthetic. It spoke to rank, faith, occupation, even morality. Imams kept trimmed beards, scholars wore neat cuts, and nobles often oiled and styled their locks with great care. Shaving it all off, or worse, leaving awkward patches, transformed a person instantly into a figure of ridicule. The punishment had layers. For soldiers, a shaved head signalled failure or cowardice. For religious men, it suggested heresy or scandal. For women, when it was used, which was rare and whispered about, it implied sexual disgrace. No blood needed to be drawn. The shame did all the work. One 17th century regulation mandated public head shaving for tax collectors found guilty of extortion. They were paraded through the marketplace, heads lopsided with awkward bald patches, with a sign hung around their necks, Kelesi kesilmedi, ama saç gitti. His head was spared, but his hair is gone. A cruel little joke from the bureaucracy. And then there was the infamous checkerboard cut. This style left alternating bald and haired patches across the scalp, resembling a chessboard. It was used on petty thieves and pickpockets. The visual was instantly recognisable from a distance, marking the wearer for ridicule. Children chased them down alleys. Shopkeepers refused service. Even their families hesitated to open the door. There was also the donkey tail style, where only a tuft of hair was left on the crown, shaped like a flicking tail. The condemned were made to wear this humiliating cut for weeks. sometimes paired with patched clothing or clinking bells sewn into their collars. It wasn't just humiliation, it was spectacle. Historians still debate where this custom originated. Some trace it back to the Mongols, others to older Persian rituals of public shame. But the Ottomans institutionalised it with flair. In some towns, entire court sessions were devoted to stylised shavings, with scribes noting the type of haircut assigned like some sadistic barber's ledger. 3 stripes shaved for lying to the imam, crown bald with side curls for spitting in the mosque, half-head removal for unpaid debt to a widow. The specificity of the punishments added insult to injury, and while the physical discomfort of head shaving was mild, save the occasional nick or razor burn, the social consequences were profound. In a society that prized dignity, modesty and appearance, the shaved head screamed failure. It wasn't always done with blades. Sometimes, particularly in rural areas or during military campaigns, the razors were swapped for broken pottery shards or dull knives. The result? Ragged, uneven patches, often bleeding. One soldier's journal from the late 1500s recounts how, after deserting his unit, he was caught and given a 3-day head by a vengeful sergeant. Each day, a different section of his scalp was shaved off, forcing him to walk around half bald like a living calendar of shame. There were also superstitions. In some provinces, people believed that forced head shaving removed not just dignity, but luck. A person who lost their hair in disgrace might never succeed again in trade, marriage, or faith. Families sometimes paid bribes to have punishments carried out in private, to avoid public association with the bald curse. A fringe tale even claims that one provincial governor kept a gallery of shavings, drawings and wigs representing the styles of humiliation he'd ordered. Visitors were reportedly shown these while sipping coffee, like a morbid art exhibit. This one, he'd say, pointing to a particularly awkward swirl, was for a merchant who lied about grain prices. Took 3 months before anyone bought from him again. Perhaps most eerie were the occasions when the condemned weren't told why they were being shaved. This was psychological warfare. A man might be seized in the middle of the night, his hair cut off without explanation, and then released. He'd walk the streets, unsure of his crime, tormented not only by the looks of strangers, but by the paranoia that he'd offended the state in some unknown way. There's a report of one such victim, a minor clerk from Bursa, who spent years trying to earn back his unspoken sin, fasting and donating to mosques until he died of fever. His tombstone bore no name, just the image of a razor carved in shallow relief. Whether it's real or apocryphal, the tale haunted generations of bureaucrats who feared the razor more than the rope. And it wasn't just men. Though rare and almost never documented officially, stories swirl of women in harems or peasant villages punished by partial shavings. One legend tells of a concubine who leaked secrets to a rival sultan's court. Rather than execution, her mistress ordered her head shaved in rings, one for each secret told. She lived, but her mirrors were removed, and her hair never grew back properly. Others say she wore scarves for the rest of her life, never speaking above a whisper. The razor, in that sense, became a silent enforcer. It whispered through society, cutting status down without drawing blood. And unlike other punishments, it left no permanent mark, at least not on the skin. But reputations, those rarely healed. In Istanbul's older neighbourhoods, elderly barbers still tell stories about state cuts, a term passed down from their grandfathers, who had allegedly styled the heads of disgraced men trying to grow their hair back without revealing the telltale pattern. Some refused service, others, quietly sympathetic, offered cover-up trims and sympathetic silence. By the late 19th century, as Western-style reforms swept through the empire, public shaving punishments fell out of favour. The state leaned toward fines, imprisonment, and formal trials. But echoes of the practice remained. Schoolteachers still shaved unruly students' heads as a warning. Military officers threatened recruits with donkey cuts for poor discipline, and among prisoners, the threat of the razor remained a tool of informal hierarchy. Today you won't see checkerboard scalps walking the streets of Istanbul, but the memory lingers, in idioms, in jokes, in cautionary tales. Don't get the barber's justice, older folks say, meaning don't let your shame be louder than your crime. So tonight, when you look in the mirror and run a hand through your hair, consider what it meant centuries ago, to lose it not by choice but by decree. In the Ottoman world, a blade to the scalp was a verdict rendered in silence. No need for whips or fire, just a whisper, a snip, and a life turned upside down. The descent begins with a creak. A rusted iron hinge moans open as a torch flickers to life. The stairs spiral downward, carved roughly into damp stone, their edges worn slick by centuries of footsteps, some returning, many not. The air thickens with mildew and something older, sourer. Below Istanbul's bustling surface lies Yedikule Fortress, and within it, a legend of terror, the sewer cellars, a punishment not of whip or fire, but of disappearance. Yedikule, 7 towers, was more than just a fortress. Built into the old Theodosian walls of Constantinople, it had originally welcomed envoys, guarded treasures, and held banners of empire. But by the 17th century, it had earned another reputation entirely, that of an oubliette, a place where people went to be forgotten, its most infamous prison chambers, deep beneath, partially submerged in water, infested with rats, mould, and silence. The sewer cellars were not named for sewage exactly, but for their layout, moist, sunken vaults that once may have been cisterns, but had long since become places of exile and torment. The punishment was simple and devastating, confinement. The condemned was led into the underground cells and locked inside, often alone, sometimes with 1 or 2 others. No beatings, no interrogations, just time, endless, echoing time, and water. A few inches of standing liquid on the floor, always cold, always seeping into boots and bones. Sleep was rare, disease was inevitable, hope was a rumour. No light reached the cellars. The only illumination came when the hatch above opened briefly to lower down stale bread or a tin of water. Prisoners counted days by their meals, though these arrived irregularly, sometimes twice a day, sometimes not at all. Madness came quickly in the dark, or slowly, depending on your temperament. Records suggest the sewer cellars were used for crimes not necessarily violent, but inconvenient. A nobleman who questioned a decree, a scribe who leaked information, a merchant with too much foreign sympathy. People who knew too much, or worse, had once been trusted. Yedikule was where the empire's skeletons were hidden, and no punishment method delivered anonymity better than this. One 18th century ambassador from France wrote of trying to visit a prisoner there, a once prominent pasha accused of conspiracy. He was turned away at the gate and told, "He is now in the lower archive." A chilling euphemism. The phrase appears again in Ottoman court records, suggesting that being sent to the sewer cellars was akin to being shelved like an obsolete manuscript. The physical conditions were intentionally degrading. The dampness never left. Mice gnawed at clothing. Fungi bloomed on walls and skin alike. Some prisoners reportedly drowned in sleep, having collapsed into a shallow corner where water had risen after rain. Others slowly starved, not from lack of food, but from the parasites that inevitably followed. And yet there was structure. Guards rotated shifts, keeping logs of who entered and when. Food deliveries were logged in tallies. Corpses were removed, not in haste, but on schedule, every Friday before prayer. The body was wrapped, recorded, and buried with no name, often in unmarked graves outside the fortress walls. Their stories ended as neatly as they had been sealed away. Historians still argue whether the empire intended the sewer cellars as torture, or simply neglect. After all, no official record lists them as a place of punishment. But the whispered accounts tell another story. Testimonies from freed prisoners, few and far between, describe dreams of dripping water, voices that weren't there, and feet that never stopped tingling. One former inmate, released after 27 months, was so disoriented by daylight that he screamed for hours, convinced the sky would fall on him. A fringe but compelling rumour persists that the Ottomans experimented with sensory deprivation down there, that certain prisoners, particularly spies or suspected mystics, were placed in isolation cells within the cellars, where they were subjected to weeks of silence and total darkness, broken only by irregular feeding. The goal? To shatter their spiritual defences. Whether this is true or a shadow of Cold War fears retroactively cast onto the past, it fits the pattern. The Empire, though advanced, never shied from innovation, especially when it came to control. There were, it should be said, attempts at comfort. In later centuries, some prisoners were allowed a mat, a blanket, a copy of the Quran. But these were usually privileges bought through bribery. A few wealthier inmates managed to smuggle in tobacco or even pen and paper, though most such contraband was swiftly discovered and removed. And then there's the infamous water wall. According to some accounts, one chamber had a curved stone wall that constantly wet moisture. No one could explain why. It didn't flood, it didn't dry. It just leaked. The guards avoided it. The prisoners feared it. Some believed the wall absorbed madness and reflected it back. One prisoner is said to have painted faces on the stones with mould, giving each a name. When he died, the faces remained, though they vanished when the wall was cleaned years later. By the mid-1800s, with the Tanzimat reforms aiming to modernise Ottoman governance, the use of the sewer cellars declined. New prisons were built above ground, with cells and windows and even, gasp, scheduled visits. The fortress fell into partial disuse, then historical obscurity. But the legend endured. Tourists today walk along Yedikul's sunlit courtyards with barely a thought for the trapdoors beneath their feet. And yet those who know, the guides, the historians, the old caretakers, sometimes hesitate near certain corners. "That one doesn't open anymore," they'll say, pointing to a rusted plate in the stone. "Best it stays that way." And here's a quirky footnote. The cellars inspired stories beyond Ottoman borders. In Victorian London, serialised novels referenced Ottoman oubliettes, where villains were swallowed by wet stone and forgotten. One particularly bad penny dreadful even claimed a ghostly Turk haunted the Tower of London, dripping water and muttering in Arabic. Pure nonsense, of course, but proof that Yedikule's fear travelled far. The psychological weight of the cellars lives on too. In Turkish folklore, a certain type of jinn is said to dwell in cold underground spaces. They whisper secrets in the dark, feeding on loneliness and damp. In some villages, misbehaving children are warned not with threats of monsters, but with the phrase, "Keep it up, and we'll see what Yedikule has for you." The empire didn't need fire or knives here. Just stone, silence, and time. And in many ways, that was worse. Victims of the sewer cellars weren't executed, they weren't even judged in public. They were erased, not quickly, not violently, but inch by inch. A slow unknitting of identity. Tonight, if you find yourself dreaming of narrow stairs and the drip of water echoing through stone, don't panic, but do take a breath. Because in the Ottoman Empire, the worst punishments weren't always the loudest. Sometimes the scariest place was the one where nothing happened at all, just you, the dark, and the endless waiting. The scribe's hand trembles slightly as he reaches for a fresh page. His eyes dart to the corner of the room, where a prisoner kneels in silence, hands bound, mouth firmly shut. Not because he chooses quiet, but because he no longer has a tongue to speak with. This is not poetic silence, not the result of some spiritual vow or contemplative trance. This is the outcome of one of the Ottoman Empire's more chilling punishments, tongue removal. The Ottomans, for all their bureaucratic flair and methodical governance, knew the dangers of words. Words could unravel armies, words could sway cities, words could spark insurrections. In a courtly world where political secrets and religious sensibilities dance tightly together, the wrong utterance at the wrong time could mean ruin. And sometimes that ruin took the shape of silence, enforced, surgical, irreversible. Tongue removal wasn't as common as, say, bastinado or imprisonment, but when it was done, it was meant to send a message, quite literally. The condemned, often poets, preachers, spies, or political agitators, were silenced not with jail or threats, but with knives. The procedure itself varied. In some cases, the tongue was cut at the root, a brutal, bloody process with a high chance of death from infection or blood loss. In others, only the tip was taken, enough to impair speech, distort pronunciation, and ruin careers. A court singer who offended the wrong official might find himself unable to sing the next morning. A scholar who questioned religious dogma might discover that his tongue was now 2/3 shorter, and every word he spoke turned to mush. One particularly unsettling case tells of a poet in the 17th century who composed a satirical ode mocking a regional governor's diet. Apparently he'd grown fat on dates and honey during a local famine. The poem spread like wildfire. He was arrested, not tried, and subjected to a partial glossectomy. He lived, but his career was over. He spent the rest of his life selling trinkets near a mosque, occasionally humming the rhythm of his lost poem to anyone who would listen. Historians still argue whether tongue removal was officially sanctioned or carried out by overzealous regional authorities. Some court records are deliberately vague, referring only to corrections of the mouth or silencing measures, but the stories are too consistent, too numerous to dismiss. Across provinces and decades, whispers of mutilated tongues surface again and again. Even more insidious were the mute courts. Yes, mute courts. These weren't filled with those punished for speaking, but were trials where speech itself was forbidden. Only gestures, writing, or signs could be used. Established during politically sensitive times, such as succession disputes or periods of religious upheaval, these courts were a chilling experiment in silence as discipline. Witnesses scribbled their testimonies. Judges nodded or raised fingers to issue verdicts. There was no cross-examination, no outburst, no defiance. Only scratching pens and the occasional cough. Some claim the mute courts were inspired by Sufi traditions of contemplation and inner restraint. Others believe they were a pragmatic way to control emotional testimony, especially in blasphemy trials. But the effect was always the same. Speechlessness, forced or chosen, became the empire's most suffocating courtroom attire. There's one fringe tale of a palace concubine who exposed a high-ranking official's plot by whispering into the Sultan's ear during a musical performance. The Sultan was amused and acted on her tip. The plot was foiled. The concubine? She vanished. Some say she was rewarded with jewels. Others, more grimly, say her tongue was removed to ensure she never whispered again. The truth is lost, as it often is in palaces. Another disturbing layer? The creation of silent messengers. These were men, usually eunuchs or slaves, who had been mutilated, had their tongues removed, and were trained in intricate hand signals. Used within the palace or among elite circles, these messengers delivered sensitive information wordlessly. They were both feared and pitied. Their presence always meant something significant was being communicated, something that could not, or should not, be spoken aloud. Even outside the capital, the fear of losing one's tongue lingered. It became a metaphor in folk stories and idioms. Don't let the Sultan hold your tongue meant, think before you speak. Children were warned that lying could make their tongues fall out in sleep, a spooky bedtime myth likely rooted in real, gruesome practice. And then there were the amateur enforcers, local judges or landlords who, lacking official power but wielding influence, paid thugs to deliver tongue warnings. A deep cut on the side, a missing tip. One traveller in Anatolia recorded meeting a village bard who sang with a lisp and claimed he'd once composed a love song about the wrong man's daughter. He sang now only about fruit and seasons. Not every story ended in silence, though. A few survivors managed to find new lives, communicating through gesture or slate. Some became teachers of calligraphy. Others passed down riddles and songs to children through humming alone. One particularly defiant poet, after his punishment, reinvented himself as a mime and entertained at shadow puppet theatres in Bursa, where his exaggerated expressions brought laughter instead of cries. A quirky fact: the Ottoman court maintained a collection of tongue jars. These were ceramic vessels, supposedly kept in a locked chamber, filled with salt or honey to preserve the removed organs as grim trophies or warnings. There's no hard proof of this, but an 18th century French visitor described seeing one briefly while being rushed past a palace storage room. He swore it contained the tongues of traitors, curled like sleeping worms. Whether this was real or exaggerated by a nervous foreigner, the imagery stuck. Later writers picked it up in Gothic tales and Orientalist novels, where Ottoman villains kept jars of tongues beside their beds like nightstand alarms. Ultimately, the punishment worked not just on the body, but on the society. The possibility of tongue removal chilled discourse, curtailed dissent, and encouraged self-censorship. Why risk speaking at all if silence meant survival? Even as late as the 19th century, travellers in the Ottoman Empire remarked on the careful tone of public speech. In tea-houses and marketplaces, conversation danced around sensitive topics. Everyone knew someone, or had heard of someone, who had spoken too freely and paid the price. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy, embedded in the muscle memory of 1,000 forgotten tongues. Today, few traces remain. Museums hold ornate knives once used in punishment ceremonies, though their placards read simply ritual tool or ceremonial blade. No mention of what they cut. The mute courts are mentioned in obscure legal texts, footnotes in the margins of empire. And the silence? That lingers most of all. So tonight, as you whisper to yourself in the dark, marvel at the power of that simple act. A voice, a word, a sound. In the Ottoman world, to speak was to risk, to remain silent was to live, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. The tongue may be small, but in the empire of crescents and shadows, it was mighty enough to cost a man his life. There is no curtain, no stage, no polished wooden floor. Instead, a cobbled courtyard fills with curious onlookers, the scent of grilled lamb wafting in from a nearby vendor. At the centre, guards circle a bound man, his chest bare, eyes wide, and stomach trembling with dread. Nearby, a long curved knife gleams in the afternoon sun. This isn't a military drill or street performance, it's a disembowelment. Public, precise, and choreographed like theatre. In the Ottoman Empire, when an example had to be made, this was the spectacle chosen. A slow, deliberate unmaking of the human body, performed not just to punish, but to impress. Public disembowelment was rare, but when deployed it held the city hostage. Markets shut down, bells rang. Word spread like wildfire. They're opening a traitor today. The crowds came not just out of fear, but out of morbid fascination. The execution wasn't merely death, it was performance. The condemned was usually a rebel, assassin, or high-profile betrayer. Someone whose demise had to echo beyond the gallows. It began with preparation. A wooden platform was erected, typically near a central mosque or court square. The condemned was bathed and fed the night before, not out of kindness, but to keep the body pliable, the stomach not distended. Executioners wore garments of oil-treated leather, gloves up to the elbows. Their tools were sharpened and laid out like surgical instruments, and indeed it was a kind of surgery, one meant not to save but to reveal. The first cut was always the slowest. Just below the sternum a shallow incision opened the abdomen, careful not to rupture the organs too quickly. Blood didn't gush, it oozed, warm and blackish red. The crowd held its collective breath as the executioner reached in and began to draw out the intestines, coiling them in gloved hands like lengths of rope. Sometimes they were laid beside the body, sometimes looped around the condemned's neck like a grotesque necklace. Always they were shown. Always the message was clear. And still, the man often lived, at least for the first few minutes. The pain, according to later medical historians, would be searing but oddly numbing in places. Shock setting in, nerves overwhelmed. The eyes would stay alert, darting wildly, mouth gasping like a landed fish. One 17th century account describes a man who tried to recite scripture even as his organs spilled onto the platform. He didn't get past the third verse. Historians still argue about the exact reasons behind this method's selection. Was it religious? Ritual? Pure deterrence? Likely. It was all three. By opening the body, the Ottomans reversed the sacred Islamic ideal of preserving bodily integrity after death. They desecrated the very symbol of life. For traitors, that denial of respectful burial was part of the punishment. A fringe belief even held that disembowelment trapped the soul in the earth, that the unsealed belly prevented ascension to paradise. Whether the Sultan believed this or not didn't matter. The people did. And so the punishment worked twice, physically in the moment, and spiritually for eternity. One particularly infamous event occurred in 1595, when a Janissary commander accused of conspiring with the Safavids was executed this way in Edirne. Eyewitnesses say that he maintained composure for almost 4 minutes as his insides were drawn out, reciting verses, proclaiming innocence. The crowd was so moved that they wept openly, yet no one intervened. Mercy had no seat in these rituals. To ensure maximum impact, the Ottoman court sometimes paired disembowelments with other punishments. A traitor might be disemboweled and beheaded, or disemboweled and impaled afterward, their organs wrapped around the stake like festive ribbons of horror. These layers weren't just cruelty, they were programming. They etched fear into the psyche. And yes, the performance aspect cannot be understated. Executioners trained for this. They practiced on livestock. They studied anatomy. A botched disembowelment, one too quick, too messy, or clumsy, could result in demotion. Or worse. These men were artists in the macabre, and the court demanded perfection. A particularly chilling footnote. In some rare instances, victims were made to walk before execution, intestines already partially drawn, looped and dragging along the ground. Not far, just enough to show movement. One Venetian ambassador described such a scene in his private diary, writing, "The man wore his own innards as scarf and leash, and yet walked with the dignity of a prince." You don't forget lines like that. Children were sometimes brought to these events, forced to witness them as civic lessons. Parents whispered, "This is what liars get," or "Speak against the Sultan and see how quickly you unravel." It was an education by horror, one that required no exams. The memory alone etched itself into obedience, and yet, for all its brutality, there was ceremony. A reader might chant verses as the execution unfolded. A mufti might be present to bless the punishment, reinforcing the notion that this act, this literal gutting, was not savagery, but justice. The blade was not merely sharp, it was sanctified. Even the clean-up had protocol. Afterward, sand was poured over the blood. The organs, depending on the case, were either burned, buried, or in some tales fed to dogs. The platform was scrubbed with vinegar and lye. By the next morning the square returned to normal. Children played. Merchants reopened stalls, but the stain in memory never lifted. In rare, deeply symbolic acts, the Ottoman state conducted reverse disembowelments on effigies, straw men dressed in royal garb, used during political theatre. These were rituals meant not to punish individuals, but ideas: treason, heresy, sedition. The dolls were cut open, stuffed with scrolls or counterfeit coins, their symbolic innards displayed. A message delivered, bloodlessly this time, but no less clearly. One fringe account, possibly apocryphal, though retold by several chroniclers, describes a political prisoner in Cairo who, in his final moments, reached into his own wound and tried to write a message in blood. He died before finishing, and no one could decipher what he meant. Still, the attempt haunted witnesses. Was it a confession? A curse? A warning? The mystery became legend. By the 1800s, public disembowelment faded. Western influence, internal reform, and the rise of printed law made such displays harder to justify. The empire needed diplomats, not demonstrators. But behind closed doors, rumours say it didn't vanish entirely. Certain deaths in the provinces, bodies returned with missing organs, funerals held behind closed veils, suggest the old ways lingered like smoke in old stone. Today, it's hard to find official records. Museums gloss over the practice, textbooks frame it as rare, but the whispers remain. In certain Istanbul alleyways, older shopkeepers say the rain still washes blood from between the stones. "It's just rust," says one, or maybe old pomegranate juice, but his eyes flick sideways as he says it. So tonight, as you lie still and listen to your own stomach gurgling softly in the dark, remember, once, in the empire of shadows, that quiet centre of your being could become the centre of a stage. In the Ottoman world, death didn't always come in silence. Sometimes it arrived with a crowd, a knife, and the terrible poetry of being turned inside out. The room is small, bare stone walls, a low ceiling, a single lantern flickering with just enough light to see what matters. In the corner sits a prisoner, his face pale, his breathing shallow. There is no blood, no rope, no blade, and yet his mouth hangs open, slack and useless, because nestled between his jaws is a steel contraption that renders speech and dignity impossible. Welcome to one of the Ottoman Empire's most subtly cruel punishments, the iron gag. Known in whispers as demir ağızlık, literally the iron mouthpiece, this device wasn't about death, it was about silence. Forced, persistent, humiliating silence. It locked the mouth open or shut, depending on the design, using a system of straps and levers, all tightened behind the head or under the jaw. The purpose? To keep the condemned from speaking, screaming or praying. Some wore it for hours, others for weeks. The gag was often used on political prisoners, religious dissenters, or anyone considered too eloquent for their own good. In a court system built on confession, coercion and whispers, a man's ability to speak could be as dangerous as a dagger. So when execution wasn't convenient and exile too generous, the iron gag offered a third option, one of stifled punishment. The earliest designs were simple, a metal bit between the teeth, much like a horse's bridle, secured with leather straps. Later models became more elaborate. Some included sharp pins to prevent the wearer from closing their mouth fully. Others held the tongue in place, swollen and exposed. Breathing became difficult. Eating was nearly impossible. saliva pooled, dripping steadily down the chin, a slow, degrading waterfall of helplessness. Historians still argue over the origins of the Ottoman iron gag. Some trace it back to medieval European scolds' bridles, devices used to punish gossiping women. Others suggest it evolved from torture implements found in Safavid Persia or Mamluk Egypt. Regardless of origin, the Ottomans made it their own, weaving it into their broader tapestry of silent punishments. One particularly grim tale comes from 17th century Aleppo, where a local imam was accused of preaching against a regional governor's corruption. Rather than execute him, officials clamped the iron gag over his mouth and paraded him through the streets. He was forced to wear it for 20 days, confined to a tiny courtyard cell, fed only thin broth and mashed figs. By the end, his gums were infected, his voice permanently hoarse, and his sermons, if he gave any again, were barely above a whisper. There was also a ritual to it. The gag wasn't just slapped on like a bit of armour, it was presented. Guards would unroll a cloth bundle like a surgeon's kit, revealing the polished steel with reverence. Some gags were engraved with Quranic verses or imperial crests, visual reminders that the wearer's silence had divine and political sanction. In more theatrical cases, the gag was fitted in public. The prisoner knelt before a magistrate surrounded by scribes and onlookers, and was muzzled while a decree was read aloud. The irony was sharp. The words explaining the punishment floated in the air while the condemned, drooling and wide-eyed, could say nothing in return, a symbolic reversal of the tongue's power. There are even records of special versions made for the palace eunuchs. These gags, sometimes made of silver or inlaid with pearls, were as much symbols of status as they were tools of control. One eunuch punished for gossiping about the harem's politics was forced to wear such a gag while serving tea. His hands still graceful, his movements elegant, but his mouth locked in shameful silence. Quirky as it sounds, a fringe group of Ottoman physicians once argued the iron gag had therapeutic value. They claimed that enforced silence calmed restless minds and overactive spirits. A 1731 medical text from Bursa includes a diagram of the gag alongside leeches and smelling salts, suggesting its use in the treatment of hysterical melancholy. Whether anyone believed this or if it was just posturing for imperial approval, we'll never know. But the idea of the gag as medicine is as disturbing as its physical use, and let's talk about hygiene, or lack thereof. The gags were rarely cleaned between uses. Prisoners frequently developed infections, ulcers and jaw dislocations. One unfortunate soul, imprisoned in Erzurum, reportedly lost half his tongue due to a rusted gag that corroded while still in his mouth. He survived, though barely, and became something of a local ghost, wandering the streets with a scarf wrapped perpetually around his face. Still, not every use of the gag was permanent. In some cases, it was a temporary sentence, a day, a week, a month, a rotating punishment used to dampen dissent without drawing blood. Prisoners might be allowed to remove the gag during sleep, or when no one else was present. Others wore it day and night, locked into it by keys only the warden carried. Imagine waking up each morning knowing the first thing that touched your lips wasn't food or prayer, but cold iron. One prisoner's diary, smuggled out and later published anonymously, describes the mental toll in brutal simplicity. At first I missed talking, then I missed tasting, then I missed breathing without pain, but what haunted me most were the words I no longer formed. I could feel them, shaped in my throat, but they died before reaching the air. There were even mute jails, entire wards filled with gagged prisoners. Whether this was official policy or a local invention, it effectively created zones of silence within larger prisons. Guards communicated with slaps or signs. Meals were sloshed into bowls without a word. In the quiet, some prisoners became closer, developing complex hand gestures, eye signals or coded foot taps to speak. Others went mad, unable to express even their name. By the 19th century, the gag faded from formal use, as reforms demanded more humane punishments. But whispers of its continued application lingered, especially in far provinces or among rogue officials. Some say it was still used unofficially into the early 20th century, repurposed not by the state, but by jealous husbands, vengeful merchants or tribal leaders bent on control. The tools survived even if the empire did not. A few examples of iron gags now reside in private collections and dusty museum back rooms. You won't see them in the glass cases. They're too uncomfortable, too personal. But they're there, each with its rusted clasp and silent story. Some bear initials, others strange grooves worn into the metal from desperate teeth. Today, the legacy of the iron gag lingers more as metaphor than artifact. In Turkish, an old saying remains, "He wears the Sultan's silence." It means someone is keeping quiet, either wisely or under pressure. The implication is unmistakable. Silence can be just as ordered as speech, and sometimes it's enforced. So tonight, as you speak your final words for the day, perhaps a good night, or a sigh, or even a whispered dream, think of those who couldn't. In the empire of crescents and shadows, silence wasn't always golden. Sometimes it was clamped tight, bitter with rust and too heavy to ever forget. The desert wind howls across the plains, stirring sand into spirals, erasing footprints almost as fast as they're made. In the distance, vultures circle low, but there are no bones yet. Not yet. Because today's condemned hasn't reached their final resting place. Not quite. First there's stitching to be done. Not on cloth, not on canvas, but on flesh. The punishment? Sewing the criminal into a fresh animal's skin, then leaving them to the mercy of heat, time, and scavengers. This grotesque method, often whispered as postmodern mummification, was one of the rarest and most symbolically terrifying punishments in the Ottoman Empire. The condemned was sewn alive into the hide of a freshly slaughtered animal, typically a camel or ox. Limbs were folded tightly, the hide wrapped snugly around the body, then stitched shut with thick twine or leather laces. As the skin dried in the relentless sun, it shrank, squeezing the body within, pressing tighter with each hour until breath itself became a struggle. Bones cracked, joints locked, and the internal organs bore the pressure like a collapsing tent. This wasn't merely death, it was compression. It was suffocation by symbolism. The very act of being bound in an animal's skin carried layers of meaning. To be returned to the beast, to be treated as less than human, to die as livestock. This was the Ottoman state saying, "You are beneath us," beneath civilization itself. The practice had Persian and Central Asian roots, likely inherited through Turco-Mongol traditions. But the Ottomans employed it rarely, and always selectively. It wasn't for petty theft or blasphemy. This punishment was reserved for spies, traitors, and intriguingly shapeshifters, men believed to be sorcerers or jinn in disguise. Whether the court believed in such creatures or simply wanted to fan fear, the result was the same: silence through suffocation. The procedure began at dusk. The condemned was bathed, not in oil or perfume, but in brackish water. This step wasn't about cleanliness, it was about control. Wet skin adhered more tightly to animal hide. Then came the hide itself, newly stripped, still warm, its inside sticky with remnants of blood and fat. The body was bent, arms and legs drawn inward like a fetus, the hide pulled over and wrapped like a grotesque burrito. Then the stitching began. One chronicler from the 1600s describes witnessing a case in eastern Anatolia where a captured Safavid spy was punished this way. He writhed inside it for hours, the writer says, but the hide, once sun-touched, became as hard as iron. By nightfall, his screams had ceased. By dawn, the hyenas dragged him away like a bundle of firewood. The timing was precise. Executioners chose dry days, no storms, no shade. The goal was desiccation, not drowning. Often the body was left atop a small rise or sand dune, elevated so birds could see, so jackals could smell. It became a monument of misery, a slow-motion execution where nature finished what the court began. A quirky, if macabre, detail. In some cases, small holes were left in the hide, near the mouth or nose, to prolong suffering. Just enough air to keep the victim alive for a day or two. A mercy, a cruelty. Perhaps both. Historians still debate the purpose. Some believe it allowed confession or final prayers. Others say it made the death more visible, more haunting. The Ottomans, never short on bureaucratic precision, recorded such executions in ledgers with dry formality. One document reads, Subject, Emir Salah, agent of Safavid court. Punishment, sewn hide, 3/4 ox near Konya. Date, 7th Muharram. The fact that the type of animal used was noted, along with the portion of the hide, adds a surreal, almost culinary touch to the account. But perhaps the most chilling detail comes from a set of court documents recovered in Erzincan. In these, several locals are fined, not for committing crimes but for attempting to free a man sewn into hide. They were arrested, whipped, and forced to watch his final moments from a distance, unable to help. The Empire made an example not just of the condemned, but of mercy itself. There's a fringe story, likely apocryphal, of a Greek merchant who survived the punishment. Stitched into a goat hide and left in the Aegean sun, he was rescued by passing shepherds, who mistook the bundle for a bloated carcass. They cut it open, found a nearly dead man, and nursed him back to health. He fled the Empire, later publishing a memoir in Venice titled "I Lived in Leather." Most historians doubt the account, but some of the anatomical details in his descriptions eerily match what would happen to a man compressed for hours in drying skin. In Ottoman folklore, the punishment became a metaphor. Children were told that liars might wake up in a goat's belly. Lovers promised each other not to vanish like meat in sun. Even today, among older Turks, an idiom lingers, "Don't make me sew you shut." It's used in jest, of course, but its origins are anything but light. Some superstitious guards believed the hides, once emptied, retained the soul of the condemned. As a result, they were often burned at night, their ashes scattered in crossroads or buried deep. No grave, no name, just soot and silence. And still, not every case was about treason. One particularly disturbing record from Diyarbakir describes a midwife accused of unlawful remedies, a euphemism for administering secret abortions. Her punishment? Sewn into sheep hide and left on a hillside. The event caused public outrage among women in the region, though their protests were quickly silenced. The story became legend, passed through lullabies and whispered warnings. Never help a woman with pain, or the sheep will wear your face. By the 19th century, with Ottoman legal reform and European pressure mounting, the practice faded into myth. Western diplomats called it barbaric, savage, a return to pre-Islamic days. Officials, eager to modernize, banned it quietly, letting the punishment slip into silence without fanfare. And yet, the imagery endured. In local shadow plays and puppet theatre, villains were sometimes shown emerging from animal hides, gasping and changed. Symbolically, it became a form of rebirth, twisted, painful, transformative. A reminder that the Empire knew not just how to kill, but how to compress life into silence, to squeeze meaning from the body like water from cloth. Today, no hides remain, no documented remains, just stories, hints, a whisper of leather in the sun. Some historians believe the method never truly existed, that it was legend, perhaps Persian or Arab, imported and exaggerated. But then they find the ledgers, the diagrams, the fine notations, sewn fully, expired 14 hours later, and they pause. So tonight, as your blanket wraps snugly around you, soft and warm, remember, in another age, another empire, a different kind of wrapping awaited the condemned. Not for comfort, not for warmth, but for silence, and the sun would tighten it hour by hour until even the breath surrendered. The ship is small, more a creaking vessel than a gallant galleon. Its sails flutter against a warm wind as the coast slowly fades into a smudge on the horizon. Aboard the deck a man stands in shackles, his eyes locked on the receding land. He is not a merchant, not a pilgrim, not a soldier. He is a prisoner, exiled to one of the Ottoman Empire's most remote and whispered-of destinations, the Islands of the Damned. Scattered like forgotten teeth across the Aegean and Marmara seas, these islands weren't officially prisons, yet served that exact purpose. They were used when execution seemed too severe, imprisonment too lenient, and silence too valuable. The Ottoman Empire, always inventive with its punishments, discovered that isolation, true sea-born exile, was a punishment that could last a lifetime without requiring a single blade. The condemned were usually men of significance, disgraced viziers, rebellious scholars, failed conspirators, or ex-lovers of palace women who had risen too far, too fast. Their crime wasn't always treason. Sometimes it was simply knowing too much. A whisper out of place, a letter intercepted, a gaze held a second too long. The sentence: send him to the islands. No list of such islands was ever official. They shifted by century and circumstance. But names recur: Marmara Island, Boscada, Imbros, and especially Kanaliada, a speck of land close enough to Istanbul to see the city on a clear day, but far enough that no voice could ever reach it. Life on the islands varied. Some exiles were given homes, crumbling stone cottages or abandoned monasteries. Others lived in caves or makeshift huts, relying on rainwater and scraps. Food arrived irregularly by boat, carried by indifferent guards or local fishermen paid to deliver goods without making eye contact. The meals? Stale bread, dried figs, goat cheese, salted fish. Just enough to survive, never enough to live. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike a prison cell surrounded by other men, these islands offered solitude in its most oppressive form. The sky was vast, the silence complete. Some men went mad within weeks. Others walked in endless circles, their sandals etching trails in the rocky earth like whispered prayers. One prisoner carved verses into pebbles and tossed them into the sea. His poems now lost to the tides. Historians still debate the origins of this punishment. Was it borrowed from Byzantine practices, a remnant of Greek exile tradition, or an Ottoman innovation crafted to address crimes too delicate for public punishment? The answer is likely a blend. The Ottomans, pragmatic and poetic, knew the value of exile. It punished the body, confused the mind, and erased the voice. And yet not every island exile was total torment. A few prisoners adapted. A disgraced treasurer exiled to Imbros reportedly grew a vineyard and sold wine to passing sailors. One deposed cleric kept bees, naming each hive after a former rival. A poet named Yahya Effendi, sent to Bozkada for criticising the Sultan's military campaign, wrote an entire divan of verse, using ink made from crushed berries and brushes fashioned from goat hair. His collection, Windswept on the Rocks, was later smuggled back to the mainland and became a cult classic among Ottoman intellectuals. But most weren't so lucky. The weather could be brutal, scorching sun in summer, cutting winds in winter. Supplies were often delayed by storms. Diseases spread unchecked. There were no doctors, no comfort. Just the sea, the wind, and the endless cycle of waiting. One particularly harrowing tale tells of a nobleman sent to Marmara Island who spent 20 years alone. His crime? Falling in love with the Sultana's favourite handmaiden. The two were caught whispering in a garden. She was confined to the harem. He was sent to sea. They never spoke again. And yet he carved her name into driftwood daily, casting the pieces into the water, hoping one might find her. None ever did. His bones were discovered in a collapsed hut surrounded by hundreds of weather-worn planks etched with a single word, Ainur. Quirky side note. In some cases, prisoners were sent with animals, usually goats or donkeys. These creatures became companions, labourers, and sometimes the only thing standing between sanity and despair. One exile, a former palace physician, trained his goat to fetch berries and bleat upon seeing ships. He called the animal Kapıcı, doorkeeper, but the islands weren't entirely forgotten. The Empire sent guards, of course, men stationed in rotating shifts, usually disinterested and corrupt. Some were cruel, taking bribes to deliver letters or food. Others were oddly sympathetic, even friendly. But few stayed long. The islands changed people. The wind carried secrets. And sometimes, it was said, you could hear crying where no one lived. The real horror, though, came not from the environment, but from the uncertainty. Many exiles weren't told their sentence length. Until the Sultan wishes otherwise, was a common decree. Days stretched into months, then years. Some prisoners assumed they'd been forgotten. Others knew it. A few tried to escape, building makeshift rafts or bribing passing boats. Most were caught. The penalty? Returned to exile, this time with fewer supplies, or worse, sewn into a hide and left to rot on the beach. There are scattered records of women being exiled, though less often and less visibly. Typically, harem members who offended the hierarchy, through gossip, failed plots, or forbidden romances, were sent to the quieter islands. Their presence was hidden, guarded, erased from the public eye. No stones bore their names, no diaries recorded their cries. Only a few scattered folk tales and half-legible inscriptions hint at their fate. Interestingly, some islands became spiritual sites. Locals believed the spirits of unjustly exiled men haunted the cliffs. One legend from Bozkada claims that if you walk the northern ridge at dusk and speak your full name aloud, you'll hear the echo return in a voice not your own, the ghostly census of the damned. By the 19th century, as the empire modernised and diplomatic eyes watched more closely, island exile fell from favour. Prisons were centralised, courts more structured. exiles still occurred, but now they were domestic, inland, bureaucratic. No more boats, no more rocks, just files, stamps and locked doors. But the legacy of the islands endured. In literature, in legend, in nightmares. Even today, fishermen refuse to sleep overnight on certain shores. The wind wakes the lonely, they say. In Istanbul, the phrase sent to the island still implies banishment, social, emotional, spiritual. A casting out beyond reach. And every so often, archaeologists find something strange. A carved plank, a makeshift shrine, a rusted iron pot sealed with wax. These are not shipwrecks. They are remains of stories long washed away, relics of those who loved, spoke or questioned too much, and paid with their presence. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine the sea outside your window, not calm but endless, not gentle but watching. And remember, in the Ottoman Empire, sometimes the worst punishment wasn't pain, it was distance, it was silence, it was waiting for a letter that never came, on an island that didn't want you, beneath stars that refused to blink. The square is packed, not with peasants or merchants this time, but with men in crisp uniforms, silver crescent pins gleaming on their chests. They are the Janissaries, the elite warriors of the Ottoman Empire, once plucked from Christian villages as boys and trained into machines of loyalty. But today, they're not here for a parade or inspection. Today, they are the condemned. And the Empire is about to show them what happens when power turns inward. The Janissaries were the backbone of the Ottoman military for centuries, fierce, disciplined, and famously loyal to the Sultan. But loyalty, like any currency, can devalue over time. By the 17th century, the core had grown bloated, political and unruly. They resisted reforms. They interfered with royal succession. They demanded bribes to stay quiet. In many ways, they became a state within a state. And when the Ottoman rulers finally decided to dismantle this internal empire, they did it with a brutality that matched the Janissaries' own legendary fierceness. Their punishments were layered, starting with isolation, moving to execution, and in the worst cases descending into grisly spectacle. When individual Janissaries stepped out of line, striking an officer, refusing an order, or plotting against a superior, they were punished with a blend of dishonour and finality. Beheading was common, but not always immediate. First came the stripping of the rank. Their uniforms were removed in public, their boots taken, their weapons snapped in two before a gathered crowd. The symbolism was intentional. A Janissary's sabre wasn't just a tool, it was identity. To break it was to unmake the man. In more dramatic cases, punishments included impalement or the bowstring, but with added humiliation. One particularly cruel variation involved tying a Janissary to a cannon, lighting the fuse and letting the force obliterate not just the body, but the reputation. The term Janissary powder emerged in whispers afterward. And then came the most infamous moment in Ottoman military history, the auspicious incident of 1826. That's when Sultan Mahmud II decided he'd had enough. The Janissary Corps had become corrupt, rebellious, and dangerously influential. So he launched a carefully orchestrated purge. With the help of loyal troops and artillery, he turned their own barracks into a trap. When the Janissaries protested a proposed reform, they gathered in Istanbul as they always did, drumming, shouting, showing strength. Mahmud waited. Then he gave the order. Cannons opened fire on their compound, flattening it. Fires followed. Survivors were hunted through the streets, executed en masse, or imprisoned. In total, thousands died in days. Those who escaped were exiled or forced into hiding. The corps was dissolved, its name erased from official ledgers. But the memory of its punishments lingered. One Janissary, captured after the purge, was reportedly sewn into a cowhide and tossed into the Bosphorus, the same sea he'd once defended with sword and shield. A dark irony the Empire likely relished. But not all punishments were fatal. Some Janissaries were humiliated into silence, forced to clean latrines, shave their beards, or serve as executioners, roles traditionally shunned within their honour code. For a soldier trained since childhood to see himself as elite, these degradations were often worse than death. There were also shadow tribunals, military courts convened at night with no records, no defence. A group of Janissaries would be summoned, accused of vague crimes like disruption of the order or disharmony in the ranks. Their sentence? Death before sunrise. No announcement, no ceremony, just a body rolled into the Bosphorus before morning call to prayer. Some historians argue whether the empire feared the Janissaries more than it respected them. Certainly their punishment suggested deep anxiety. After all, they were trained to fight enemies abroad, but increasingly became the enemies within. Every rebellion, every political interference, every whispered rumour that the Janissaries will decide the next sultan chipped away at imperial confidence. The empire responded the only way it knew how: performative, precise, and merciless. Even their internal discipline was harsh. Janissaries policed each other brutally, traitors were garroted in their sleep, drunkards were flogged before dawn parade. One misstep during a ceremonial drill could result in a broken arm, or worse, permanent reassignment to latrine duty for the rest of a soldier's service. Honour among the corps wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. A quirky footnote: there are records of Janissaries who, having been spared execution, lived the rest of their lives in enforced anonymity. No longer allowed to wear their uniforms, they were branded, literally. A small crescent tattoo was burned into the back of their necks, visible only when their heads were bowed. A permanent mark of shame. One such man, found decades later working in a spice shop in Bursa, reportedly never spoke of his service again. When asked about the faded tattoo, he simply said, "It's a reminder. To look forward, never up." And while the cause is often remembered in military museums and heroic ballads, the darker half of their legacy is tucked away, partly in Ottoman archives, partly in collective memory. Scholars still uncover references to secret prisons used only for Janissaries, hidden beneath old garrisons. Few survive to speak of them, but the walls there bear scratches, graffiti, even coded notes, a soldier's last testimony etched in stone. One such message found beneath what was once a Janissary barracks reads, "They taught us to kill, but not when they would kill us." A chilling reflection on loyalty betrayed. By the time Mahmud II was finished, the Janissary name had been expunged. Their hats with distinctive flaps were banned. Their songs, once played with pride, were silenced. But in villages across the empire, people still whispered of those punished for knowing too much, for fighting too well, for being on the wrong side of reform, and the phrase "don't march like a Janissary" became shorthand for "don't draw too much attention to your power, don't assume the empire won't notice." So tonight, as you rest and listen to the quiet beat of your heart, think of those who once marched to the thump of drums, sharp and proud, until the drums stopped and silence fell. In the Ottoman world, even the fiercest warriors could become prisoners, traitors, or ghosts, depending on who wrote the orders. A door creaks open, not with the weight of centuries, but with the hiss of steam. Inside the dimly lit chamber, shadows dance across brass tubes, coiled wires, and a peculiar iron cylinder at the centre of the room. It's not a cannon, not a stove, and certainly not anything recognisable at first glance. This is the so-called cursed pipe, a device wrapped in obscurity, whispered in imperial corridors, and feared more for what people thought it did than what it actually achieved. The Laneti Baru, cursed pipe, wasn't listed in formal Ottoman punishment manuals. It doesn't appear in the same scrolls that detail bastinado counts or bowstring etiquette. Instead, it appears in the margins of letters, in hastily scrawled reports from provincial governors, and in foreign diaries filed under curiosities. And yet, the stories are consistent enough to suggest something very real once hissed and groaned behind locked doors. The device itself was reportedly tubular, about the length of a man's torso, made of reinforced iron, with valves and nozzles that hissed under pressure. Some accounts claim it was heated by coals placed underneath, others that it used pressurized air or steam. Prisoners were bound beside it, or sometimes inside a cavity within its structure. Once activated, it would generate intense heat or pressure. The victim wasn't burned outright, but tormented by relentless waves of scalding air or piercing sound. Historians still argue, was this a torture tool, a punishment chamber, or simply a psychological weapon, its effects as much about fear as physical pain? One scribe from the early 18th century describes a rebel tax collector from the Balkans being brought to Istanbul and shown the pipe. No torture followed. The man confessed everything. Another mentions a palace official accused of smuggling manuscripts. He refused to speak for weeks, until, as the document reads, he heard the pipe whistle and began to cry. Was there a real mechanism inside, Or had the mere presence of the device, with its valves and ominous wheeze, become a self-fulfilling prophecy of dread? There's also the possibility that the pipe produced unbearable sound. A few accounts describe victims screaming from a room where no physical contact occurred. If accurate, the cursed pipe may have been one of the earliest uses of sonic torment, high-pitched tones or low-frequency vibrations amplified in a metal chamber. Today we'd call it acoustic weaponry. Back then, it was magic wrapped in machinery. A particularly grim story comes from the town of Amasya, where a local vizier ordered the pipe imported for use on a heretic accused of spreading blasphemous versions of the Quran. The man was placed near the device for 2 days. No physical wounds were visible, but when removed he could no longer speak and spent the rest of his life mumbling to himself in rhyme and whimper. The villagers believed his soul had been sucked out through his ears. The device was buried beneath the courtyard 3 days later, sealed under bricks said to be inscribed with talismanic protection symbols. Quirky detail. Some engineers, decades later, attempted to dismantle one of these rumoured pipes found in a Topkapi storeroom. It hissed once when opened, startling the crew, and then cracked in two. Inside were bronze tubes, charcoal residue, and a small scroll of paper with a single word: Suz, be silent. No two descriptions of the cursed pipe are identical. Some claim it dripped boiling water. Others say it trapped a man in airless heat. Still others insist it emitted a low, resonant hum that rattled bones and thoughts alike. The lack of consensus only amplifies its myth. What's certain is that the pipe wasn't used en masse. It was reserved for elite prisoners, people whose pain needed to remain invisible yet absolute. A prince suspected of witchcraft. A general who knew too much about failed invasions. A translator who sold Ottoman secrets to European envoys. These weren't men to flog or hang. These were men to erase, internally, quietly. The fear of the pipe extended beyond its actual use. Just referencing it was enough to quell dissent in certain quarters. "Shall I send for the pipe?" became a phrase scribes used half-jokingly when officials refused to cooperate. At least it started as a joke. But no one ever laughed twice. Interestingly, some French and Italian visitors mentioned the device in their travelogues. One Venetian ambassador described it as an Ottoman infernal organ, hissing with steam and smoke, that turns men's thoughts into liquid. Another, more sceptical, declared it a theatrical object, designed to impress foreign dignitaries and superstitious locals. Could they have both been right? There's even a fringe theory, advanced by an Ottoman engineer exiled to Crete, that the device was never used as torture, but as a lie detector. The heat, he claimed, caused physiological stress, revealing guilt or deception. If the accused began sweating, squirming, or speaking uncontrollably under its hiss, he was guilty. If he remained calm, he was innocent. It's a stretch, but given the Empire's penchant for symbolic justice, not impossible. In some cases, the pipe was reportedly brought out and not used at all, just wheeled into view, hissed dramatically, then removed. It served as a phantom threat, one that left no bruises but plenty of damp robes. One haunting anecdote tells of a palace servant who snuck into the pipe room out of curiosity. He returned pale and shaking, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. Within weeks he fell ill, stricken by fever and hallucinations. His final words, muttered in a haze, were, "It was breathing." Of course, this could all be embellishment. But the Ottomans understood something fundamental. Sometimes the suggestion of punishment is more powerful than punishment itself. A silent room, a strange shape, a hiss in the dark. That was enough to send men scrambling for confession or their sanity. And as the empire began its slow decline, the cursed pipe faded into mystery. Some say it was dismantled during Mahmud II's reforms. Others claim it was smuggled to Egypt or buried beneath the imperial arsenal. A few suggest it still exists, collecting dust behind a false wall in Topkapi, waiting to hiss once more. A peculiar modern twist. In 2007, during restoration work at a coastal Ottoman fort, workers discovered a rusted cylindrical device matching early descriptions. Historians couldn't agree on its purpose. The site was sealed again due to safety concerns. Local gossip insists that the workers refused to return because of the sound, a low hum that vibrated through their boots. Is it real? A legend? A metaphor for bureaucratic fear? Hard to say. But tonight, if your room creaks or your heater hisses and the sound feels just a bit too deliberate, don't panic. Probably just air pressure. probably not the echo of Empire's strangest machine breathing through the centuries, but just in case, maybe don't lean in too close. The brick wall looks innocuous enough, a little uneven maybe. The mortar is fresher than the surrounding stone, but nothing remarkable. That is, until the silence draws attention. No birds perch here, no guards linger, and the air just slightly colder. This is a wall with a secret. Because on the other side, within it really, someone is still there. Or was, once. This was the fate reserved for the truly condemned. Live burial, or what the Ottomans called being walled in. Duvar isin gömülmek, literally being buried inside the wall, was a punishment as final as execution, but with a theatrical edge that hung heavy on the imagination. It was used sparingly, often as a last resort for traitors, spies, or prisoners considered too dangerous to execute publicly, yet too troublesome to keep alive. And it wasn't always metaphorical. In many cases, the person was literally bricked into a chamber, or hollow within a wall, alive, awake, and aware, until death, slow and silent, took them. Unlike the executions in the square or the brutal drama of Falaka, this punishment was private. There was no cheering crowd, no declarations, only a few workers, sworn to secrecy, a priest or imam perhaps, and the condemned, gagged, bound, or sometimes allowed a final statement scrawled in chalk or scratched into a floor tile. The process was chilling in its simplicity. A section of wall was prepared, hollowed just enough to fit a human body. Sometimes the space was standing height, other times it was seated or crouched, ensuring total immobility. The person was placed inside, the opening sealed brick by brick and mortar slapped in place. The final brick was often marked with a scratch or sigil, a kind of grim calling card. Not every wall burial was done with lethal intent. In some versions, the victim was left a small hole for air and food, perhaps with the promise of release, perhaps not. They might survive for days, even weeks, scratching at the inside with fingernails, whispering to themselves, or, most hauntingly, singing. A French traveller in the 17th century claimed to have passed a section of the Galata fortress wall where, at dusk, he heard faint humming. The guards told him nothing, but an older janitor whispered, "That one has a voice. She sings when the sun dies." Whether a ghost or a dying girl, the story lodged itself in European imaginations and spawned dozens of legends. Historians still argue whether walling in was a distinct Ottoman invention or a borrowed Byzantine horror. The walls of Constantinople, already layered with secrets, were the perfect setting for such a fate. Some suspect the Ottomans adopted the method as a symbolic way of sealing off threats, literalizing the idea of cutting someone off from the world. One recorded case involved a high-ranking eunuch who had uncovered a harem scandal too sensitive for trial. Rather than risk whispers, he was retired to the marble, as the euphemism went. Palace workers later noted a sudden shift in temperature near a certain hallway. Flowers placed nearby wilted unnaturally fast. No one dared mention him again. There are reports of entire cells, small brick rooms with no doors, used for this very punishment. Hidden within palaces, fortresses, or even bathhouses, these spaces became traps. One janissary, after a failed plot to assassinate a pasha, was reportedly drugged, carried into such a space, and bricked in overnight. When a cleaning boy accidentally uncovered the outline of the chamber years later, it was empty. Only a dent in the floor where he'd knelt remained. And then there's the chilling ritual of the one-brick prisoner. In this variation, used sparingly, the condemned was walled in with a single removable brick, through which food, water and air could pass. The condition? They must confess or cooperate to earn their freedom. Some spoke within hours, others held out for days, a few never broke. Eventually the brick was sealed, and silence followed. A fringe, quasi-mystical version of this punishment appears in Ottoman Sufi folklore. It tells of a man who spoke blasphemy in a sacred lodge and was sentenced to eternal reflection. He was bricked into a chamber with nothing but a mirror, no light, no voice, just his own face, forever. Whether real or allegorical, the image haunts even sceptical scholars, and not all who were walled in were officially sentenced. Some were simply made to disappear. One harrowing tale from a mosque in Bursa tells of a teenage boy accused of reading banned Persian texts. He vanished overnight. Decades later, during renovations, a hollow column revealed bones, a crumbling satchel, and fragments of paper, poetry still legible in the dry air. The psychological torment of this punishment cannot be overstated. Death by suffocation is horrifying enough, but to feel time pass, to hear footsteps beyond the wall, to smell meals being cooked, to sense the living world so near, yet unreachable, that is a despair reserved for fables and nightmares. Even construction workers were often sworn to secrecy or paid handsomely to keep quiet. Some reportedly vanished themselves. The logic being, a man who lays the last brick may carry a guilt too heavy to bear, or a truth too risky to share. Curiously, certain bricks in Ottoman architecture bear strange carvings, faces, eyes, or what appear to be mouths. Scholars debate whether these were idle scribbles by masons or hidden memorials. One theory suggests sympathetic workers left these markings as talismans, granting the walled-in prisoner some fragment of humanity amid the stone. Not all wall burials were hidden. In some cases the outline was made visible, deliberately different coloured brick, a bulge in the wall, a plaque with no name. These were warnings, ghosts made visible. "Here lies silence," one scratched inscription reads. Another, on the outer wall of a coastal fortress, simply says, "He lied to the Sultan." By the 19th century, with the empire modernising and the optics of such punishments becoming unpalatable, walling in was abandoned, at least officially. But rumours persisted, especially in isolated provinces or among rogue governors, and in restoration efforts across Anatolia and the Balkans, workers occasionally find bones, sealed behind centuries-old stonework, no records explaining their presence. One such discovery in 1983 sent shivers through the archaeological community. Beneath a ruined watchtower, restorers found a perfectly preserved sitting skeleton, its fingers curled inward, a rusted iron bowl beside it. Carbon dating confirmed a 17th century origin. No injuries were found, just dust, silence, and the absence of air. Today, live burial survives only in story. In Turkish, the phrase "duvara yazıldı," he was written into the wall, means someone has vanished without explanation. Gone. Archived in stone. So tonight, as you lie nestled between your walls, listening to their quiet reassurance, consider the walls that don't speak, the ones that once did, that still might. In the Ottoman Empire, punishment didn't always draw blood. Sometimes it was the deliberate decision to let someone vanish in slow motion, sealed behind silence, forgotten in plain sight. The drums begin at dawn, steady, solemn, and unmistakable. They echo down alleys and across courtyards, calling the curious from their beds and the guilty from their hiding places. Today, a punishment will be paraded, not hidden in shadows, not hushed in courtrooms, but marched through the streets in all its degrading glory. This is the Ottoman ritual of public humiliation, where shame becomes a moving display and the condemned becomes their own warning sign. Known in Ottoman legal records as teşhir cezası, the punishment of exposure, this method didn't involve blood or chains. Instead, it relied on something much more enduring: disgrace. The convicted were marched through neighbourhoods while the townspeople watched, pointed, and sometimes joined in the ritual of shaming. It wasn't always violent, but it was always unforgettable. The offences that led to public humiliation varied. Petty theft, fraud, adultery, blasphemy, bribery, and political dissent could all qualify. What they shared was a sense of betrayal, of social contracts broken. The goal wasn't just to punish the offender, but to reinforce the moral order. And what better way to do that than to put shame on parade? The condemned might be barefoot, clad in rags, or forced to wear symbolic clothing. A butcher who sold spoiled meat might wear entrails draped around his neck. A corrupt tax collector might be dressed in gold-coloured rags while coins clinked mockingly in a pot before him. In one notorious case from 1732, a woman who lied about her social rank wore a veil made of chicken feathers and was carried on a donkey backward through the Grand Bazaar. The route was always carefully planned, past mosques, markets, fountains and guild halls. Not just busy places, but meaningful ones. The path was the sermon. Each step broadcast the crime louder than any crier could. Alongside the condemned walked officials, scribes and guards, some holding placards with the person's name and offence. "He cheated the mosque fund," one read. "She lied about her lineage," another, "a human sandwich board of sin." Sometimes music accompanied the procession, not joyful but jeering. Drums, whistles, or even tambourines banged off rhythm to disrupt any air of dignity. Street vendors joined in, tossing scraps or shouting slogans. Children mocked, old women scolded. Every voice became a stone. Historians still debate whether this was inspired by older Byzantine practices or if the Ottomans simply perfected a regional habit. What's clear is that they turned humiliation into choreography. The punishment began the moment the condemned stepped into the street and ended only when they returned, either to prison, to exile, or in some cases to a scaffold. A fringe, almost comical variant of this punishment involved being doused in honey or syrup and tied to a post in a square. This was common for liars or swindlers. The sugary coating attracted flies, bees, and the occasional cat, making the condemned a literal feast for insects. It wasn't fatal, just incredibly unpleasant, and quite effective in sticking to public memory. One account from Damascus describes a coffeehouse owner accused of plotting anti-government sermons. He was paraded through the city with a wooden cup affixed to his head, labelled "Brews words, not beans." He was spat on, slapped, and had coffee grounds dumped over him. He lived, but never served another cup again. Not all parades ended at home. Some transitioned into harsher punishments. A man shamed for theft might then receive bastinado. A woman humiliated for adultery could be sent into exile. The procession was often just the opening act, the trauma before the pain. But some, bizarrely, found ways to subvert it. A poet named Halim Effendi, accused of satirical writings, was paraded through Istanbul wearing donkey ears made from parchment etched with his own verses. Instead of breaking, he sang during the procession, his poetry loudly, theatrically. The crowd, initially mocking, fell silent. By the end, some even applauded. The Sultan, hearing of this, reportedly commuted his sentence and banned parading poets altogether. This incident raises the scholarly debate. Was public humiliation always effective? Or did it sometimes backfire, creating martyrs instead of cautionary tales? Another quirk. Some officials allowed the condemned to carry signs apologising to specific people. "I lied to Haji Osman, may he forgive me," read one placard. These personalised touches turned public shame into a deeply social wound. The entire community became witness, judge, and, on rare occasion, healer. And then there were the masks. Yes, masks. In certain cases, offenders were forced to wear wooden masks shaped like animals, donkeys for liars, pigs for gluttons, roosters for braggarts. These were not subtle. Carved, painted, and sometimes augmented with feathers or fake beards, they transformed the condemned into cartoons of vice. The effect was both absurd and chilling. A grown man, eyes red with tears, stumbling through cobbled streets wearing a rooster beak while children chant behind him. It stuck. Not all masks were removable. One cruel variant involved iron muzzles locked in place for hours or even days, preventing speech and biting the cheeks if the condemned attempted to cry out. These often left bruises, welts, and in some cases, permanent jaw damage. A particularly dark tale comes from the city of Edirne, where a scribe accused of falsifying court records was publicly paraded with ink pots chained to his wrists and fingers stained black. The public mocked him by pretending to sign his forehead as he walked. He was reportedly never hired again. Despite all this, some punished individuals managed to reclaim their lives, though slowly. Ottoman society, while rigid, wasn't devoid of forgiveness. A successful penance, public apology, or generous donation to a mosque could wash away past shame. But the parade left a trace. People remembered. Even children born long after would hear stories of the donkey man or feathered woman. By the late 1800s, public humiliation waned. The rise of formal prisons, Western influence, and changing views on dignity and state power made such spectacles unfashionable. Punishment moved behind walls, less theatrical perhaps, but more efficient. And yet, in language and culture, the echoes remain. In Turkish, the idiom "yüzü teşhir oldu," his face was exposed, still means someone's secret is out. Shame walks without parade, but the streets remember. Today, in old quarters of Istanbul, certain stairways and fountains still bear faded carvings or plaques, markers of once-rooted shame, and once a year in certain village festivals, playful punishment parades are held where costume villagers reenact historical justice. Laughter now replaces jeers, but the bones of the ritual still move beneath the costume. So tonight, as you walk through your own memories, past mistakes, old embarrassments, and silent apologies. Remember those who walked theirs through the crowded streets of empire. Their steps weren't just punishment. They were the theatre of morality, performed live, unrehearsed, and unforgettable. Behind thick curtains and gilded screens, down corridors where silence is commanded rather than suggested, lies a part of the Ottoman Empire often draped in mystery. The world of women, the harem, the cloisters, the private gardens. These spaces were rarely glimpsed by outsiders, and when punishment occurred here, it did so behind closed doors. But that didn't mean it was gentle. On the contrary, the empire had an entire lexicon of punishment tailored specifically for women. Quiet, psychological, and devastating. Women in the Ottoman world, especially within the palace, lived under rules that governed everything from their speech to their gaze to the way they walked in the presence of others. The power they held, while often invisible, was real. Concubines could become mothers of sultans, servants could rise through charm or manipulation, and even a whisper in the right ear could reshape policy. But with that power came a matching arsenal of punishments. Unlike the more theatrical justice inflicted on men, women were often punished with confinement. Not in traditional prisons, but in rooms, sometimes elegant, sometimes barren, meant to isolate and neutralise. These cloisters, called decreto darlara, isolation chambers, were part of the palace complex, their doors padded to muffle sound, their windows barred or absent altogether. A woman accused of gossip, betrayal, or even ambition beyond her rank might be locked away indefinitely. Meals would be passed through a slot in the door. No visitors, no news, just solitude. In some cases, they were allowed books or prayer beads. In others, nothing. The sentence might last a week, or a lifetime. One concubine, known in records only as Zumrut, reportedly spent 13 years in a cloister for speaking against the Valide Sultan. Her name became a cautionary whisper among younger girls. Don't bloom too soon, or you'll wilt in silence like Zumrut. There were more performative punishments too. A woman might be forced to wear black for a year, signalling disgrace, or have her jewellery melted down publicly, stripping her of status not just symbolically but economically. Some were demoted to the lowest ranks, required to clean the very floors they once strutted over in silk slippers. In rare and particularly dramatic cases, the empire resorted to geographical exile. Women banished from the harem were sometimes sent to distant estates or convent-like retreats, where they lived under surveillance. These were the Kadın Zindanları, women's prisons, though not made of stone and iron. They were homes, villas, remote dwellings, gilded cages where reputation and memory withered. Historians still debate the degree to which physical punishments were used on women. Some argue that beatings were rare, reserved for servants rather than concubines or noblewomen. Others point to accounts of bastinado adapted for female captives, done privately, with great care not to leave visible marks. One foreign observer claimed to have heard rhythmic crying from behind a marble screen, followed by the sound of soft whips upon skin. Whether true or embellished, it hints at a system where physical and psychological harm were delicately balanced. And then there were the silent dismissals, the most feared punishment of all. A woman who had fallen from grace might simply disappear. Her quarters emptied overnight, her belongings repurposed, her name never spoken again, no announcement, no trial, just absence. It was a form of erasure that terrified even the most powerful. The harem kept detailed records, births, gifts, movements. But punishment entries were cryptic. She has been removed. Her voice will no longer echo, return to her origin. These were euphemisms thick with finality. A fringe detail adds eerie depth. In some wings of the palace, a servant would place a single jasmine blossom outside a woman's door as a warning. White meant silence was expected. Red meant an offence had been noted. A woman who found both in 1 week often didn't wake in the palace the next. Outside the palace, punishment for women was more visible, yet no less harsh. In villages, women accused of adultery or witchcraft might be paraded, their heads shaved or veiled in ashes. Some were bound to donkeys backward and led through town. These rituals weren't about pain, they were about control. They taught other women to be small, obedient, and quiet. One case from a mountain town in Anatolia describes a woman whose only crime was visiting a healer thought to be a mystic. She was sentenced to 3 days of public silence, forced to wear a gag made of woven cloth, and escorted to the marketplace daily. Her shame was etched not into skin, but into memory. A strange but fascinating ritual punishment involved hair. Women who defied family orders were sometimes forced to unbraid their hair publicly and walk in silence through town, trailing it behind them. This was symbolic defiance inverted, femininity undone in full view. The shame wasn't in the walk, but in being unmade. One legend tells of a baker's wife in Edirne who dared to speak against the local imam. Rather than whipping or fining her, the village elders ordered that she bake without yeast for an entire year. Symbolically, flat, like her spirit was expected to be. Her bread didn't rise, and neither did her voice. Not all women submitted, of course. Some wrote poetry in exile, others sent coded letters through loyal servants. One concubine reportedly smuggled messages via embroidery, tiny stitches forming rhymed warnings stitched into sashes and veils. When discovered, she was sent not to a cloister, but to a remote bathhouse where she served in silence for 7 years, folding towels and watching steam rise like prayers unsaid. A peculiar case emerges from 18th century Istanbul, where a harem tutor was accused of teaching girls to read banned poetry. Rather than trial, she was forced to wear a blindfold for 3 months, allowed to walk, eat, sleep, but never to see. Her world became darkness. Some say she began humming verses instead, memorizing books in silence, her mind becoming a lantern none could extinguish. By the twilight years of the empire, as reform and revolution rolled through the palaces, these punishments faded or changed shape. Public rituals softened, cloisters emptied, the veil of secrecy lifted just a little. Women began writing openly, publishing, participating, but the scars of older systems lingered, invisible but felt. Today, most of these punishments survive only in shadow, in stories half remembered, in idioms that outlived their origins. Her door is jasmine dark means a woman has fallen out of favour. She walks with braided silence, suggests a person knows more than she dares to speak. These phrases, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, carry the weight of centuries. So tonight, if you hear soft footsteps in your dreams, quiet, purposeful, weaving through satin curtains and marble floors, remember the women who walked those paths before. Not all punishment screams. Some simply shuts the door. Some braids shame into silence. And some, like the jasmine placed outside the door, bloom just once to say, "Be careful, they're watching." The lamps burn low in the corridors of Topkapi, casting shadows that reach farther than light ever could. This final chamber isn't marked on maps, and no guide stops to explain its purpose. And yet, those who pass by seem to hush themselves. Here, in this space where the walls breathe secrets, the Sultan's most private punishments were once carried out, unseen, unspoken, but no less real. Welcome to the realm of silent justice. Unlike the public punishments of the square, or the formal decrees of the divan, the Sultan's personal retributions existed in a twilight world. These were not punishments announced or recorded. They were decisions whispered to select aides, carried out with surgical precision and sealed in silence. No official charges, no trials, just a quiet order passed hand to hand like a glass of poison. The targets, often those closest to power, trusted advisors, harem favourites, distant cousins, or gifted slaves who rose too fast. They weren't always guilty. Sometimes they were simply inconvenient. A glance misinterpreted, a gift refused, a dream that reached too high. Punishment here took many forms. Some, like the bowstring or silent exile, we've already seen. But the palace also crafted subtler punishments, ones that left no scars, only absences. There was, for example, the Room of Stillness. Officially it was a guest chamber, but when repurposed it became a sensory tomb. The condemned, usually a servant or eunuch, was placed inside with food and water but no contact, no windows, no human voice. The guards outside rotated shifts in silence. It was said a man could forget language after 40 days within. One victim emerged unable to speak for the rest of his life. When he died, no one even remembered why he'd been placed there to begin with. Another eerie tactic was ghosting. A courtier would wake one morning to find himself removed from palace rosters. His name vanished from records, his room reassigned, servants instructed not to see him. Doors that once opened now remained closed. He became a presence without identity, living within the palace yet shunned like a phantom. Many took their own lives. Others wandered disoriented until the guards escorted them out the gates and into the anonymity of the streets. The harem had its own version, the invisible veil. A woman would remain in her quarters, but her meals would be reduced, her attendants reassigned, her baths denied. She became forgotten, surrounded by luxury, yet starved of attention. It was punishment through absence, not confinement. One concubine, previously favoured, spent 2 years under this sentence, her only companion a mirror she began speaking to daily. By the time she was pardoned, she had renamed herself after the moon, and of course, there was poison. The Ottoman court, like many royal houses, was no stranger to the silent dispatch of those deemed too dangerous. The poisons used were not dramatic, they did not foam the mouth or twist the body, they were subtle, a cough that never left, a hand that trembled more each day, sometimes slipped into sherbet, sometimes painted onto a ring, sometimes merely passed on a cloth pressed to the lips. One valet of Sultan Murad IV was found dead in his bed after preparing the Sultan's bath, healthy at dusk, breathless by dawn. No investigation followed. His quarters were sealed, his belongings burned, and his name stricken from the palace registry. The Sultan's reach extended beyond the palace, of course. Silent punishments rippled outward into the provinces. A judge who ruled against imperial preference might be promoted to a post in a desolate village, a kind of bureaucratic exile. A governor whose taxes were late might find his sons drafted suddenly, his family's properties audited. These weren't punishments as decrees, they were punishments as consequences. The Sultan never needed to explain. Historians still argue about the balance of fear and strategy behind these methods. Were they acts of tyranny or necessity? A sultan ruled not just an empire, but a court full of ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. To survive, he had to act decisively. But when the blade became too visible, it sparked rebellion. Thus, silence became his deadliest weapon. A curious case emerged in the mid-18th century involving a scholar who advised on astrology. He predicted a storm that never came. Days later, his books were confiscated, and he was reassigned to a school in rural Anatolia. The locals claimed he never spoke again. Instead, he taught through writing on clay tablets, erasing his lessons as quickly as they were written. His students called him the Sandman. And still, some punished figures found ways to re-emerge. A few returned from silent exile bearing new names and altered faces, slipping back into society like shadows. One palace servant punished for eavesdropping reappeared years later as a street storyteller. He never spoke of the palace, but the tales he told were uncanny, full of corridors and whispers, eunuchs and jasmine. A fringe belief among mystics held that those punished in silence absorbed the sins of the court, that by suffering without spectacle, they cleansed the empire's spiritual debt. This idea gave rise to a peculiar practice in some dervish orders, where initiates underwent days of intentional silence in dark rooms, to taste the edge of imperial justice and emerge wiser. By the 19th century, many of these silent punishments faded. As the empire modernized and law codified itself, courts demanded transparency, at least on paper. But within the palace, the habits died slowly. Even when no longer official, the threat of being unremembered remained a powerful tool. No longer law, but legacy. Today, visitors to Topkapi walk past rooms where these punishments may have occurred. They see silk cushions, golden tiles, silver ewers. The silence is beautiful, almost sacred. But beneath it lies a truth. For centuries, that silence wasn't peace. It was punishment. No records remain of all those lost to silent justice. No monuments mark the room of stillness, but the walls remember. And sometimes, when the wind rattles the lattice, or a shadow moves across marble, it's easy to imagine a figure standing quietly, waiting to be remembered. So tonight, as your room darkens and the quiet stretches long, consider this. Not all punishment needs pain. Sometimes it just needs stillness. A name struck from a list. A step unheard. A memory faded until only the silence remains. Let your breath settle now. Let the shadows shrink back into corners. Tonight's journey has been long, winding through hidden doors beneath damp stones and across windswept islands where time slows and silence rules. These punishments, as horrifying as they were, also tell us something deeper, about fear, about power, about the ways empires sculpt not just history, but the human soul. But that's behind us now. The drums have faded, the gags are removed, the candles burn low and the whispers rest. Feel the weight lift from your shoulders. Let your pulse slow. You are safe, you are still, and nothing waits behind your walls but sleep. Whatever haunted the courts of sultans will not follow you here. So pull the blanket a little higher, find that perfect spot in the pillow's curve and let go. You've earned your rest.